To hear this audiobook in full, please visit the links in the description below. Thank you for your support. America's Protectionist Takeoff, 1815 to 1914. The Neglected American School of Political Economy. By Michael Hudson. Audiobook Section 1. Dedication. I dedicate this book to the memory of Gus Kelly and Sam Ambaras, antiquarian economics booksellers in New York City, who provided me with the raw materials for this volume a half-century ago. Preface. When I began my economic studies in 1961, my mentor Terence McCarthy advised me to focus on the flowering of classical theory in the 19th century. For starters, he suggested that I read every book cited in the bibliography of Marx's Theories of Surplus Value, which he had just translated, its first publication in English. Because many of these books were too rare to be available in the library at New York University where I was enrolled, I haunted the New York bookstores. Despite their rarity, most 19th century economics texts could still be picked up for only a few dollars, as there was little demand for books deemed intellectually obsolete. I soon became friends with New York City's three dealers in rare economics books: Augustus Kelly, Samuel Ambaras, and Sidney Millman. Kelly hired me to review and recommend books for his burgeoning reprint company, paying me in kind for many years out of his enormous inventory. Being a contrarian by nature, I selected titles I had never heard of, by authors who did not appear in the literature. Among the most neglected writers were the 19th century American protectionists. Not even ostensibly, encyclopedic studies of American economic thought paid much attention to them, treating them patronizingly as anomalies rather than the men who designed the nation's rise to industrial supremacy. Political histories of the United States tended to focus on the Democratic Party, as if the Republicans, and the Whigs before them, had no distinct economic program, much less a body of theory more realistic and empirically relevant than those of Malthus and Ricardo, to which the Democratic Party subscribed. The protectionist doctrine that shaped America's industry and agriculture is out of fashion in today's free trade world. Academically, it went beyond the narrow boundaries of today's economics discipline by deeming public policy and technology central to economic theorizing, not exogenous. Analyzing what was needed to increase productivity, the American school emphasized that wages and prices had to be high enough to sustain rising living and educational standards for labor, and investment in rising energy mobilization by capital. To me, this broad scope is what made these writers so interesting. I felt as if I were discovering a lost civilization, that which the United States sought to become along much different economic lines, socially and intellectually more secular than was the case in Europe, and free of its class antagonisms thanks to its economy of high wages doctrine. While I was searching for a dissertation topic along these lines in 1964, the wage and price guidelines that President John F. Kennedy had proposed for the steel industry were still in the news. These guidelines called for wages to be increased in keeping with productivity. This seemed to explain productivity simply by employees working harder, without reference to capital investment or technology resulting from research and development. I was surprised that employers did not respond by arguing that capital and development costs should be factored into productivity calculations. If they increased wages in proportion to the rise in output per man-hour, would this deter them from investing in labor-displacing plant and equipment and increasing energy use per production worker? The NYU professor teaching growth and productivity models was Solomon Fabricant, moonlighting from his day job as research director at the National Bureau of Economic Research. When I suggested reviewing the history of concepts of productivity and explanation of its growth over time as my dissertation topic, he urged me to find something else to write about, because the National Bureau had defined productivity simply as output per man-hour, that is, output divided by labor time. But when I asked about capital productivity, Prof. Fabricant pointed out that Edward Denison and Robert Solow had correlated the quantity of labor and the dollar value of capital investment with output. The statistical residual unexplained by this simple correlation was deemed to be technology. Without further explanation, it seemed to be produced freely by the momentum of scientific progress. No attempt was made to go below the surface and analyze why productivity occurred when and where it did or did not, or who received its benefits labor via wages, or industrial capital via profits, or finance via interest, or the government via taxes and user fees. It has become fashionable among economists to take a given variable, plug it into a historical ratio with some other statistical series, and seek a correlation. Any time series can be correlated with any other. What is not correlated can be defined narrowly or broadly, simplistically, or in a more complex way. It can be called technology, public policy, divine intervention, or whatever one wants. Denison called the unexplained variable left over from statistics on labor and capital investment technology. The implication was that, like capital formation, it occurred independently from public policy. This afforded an excuse to avoid examining the role played by tariff and tax policy, public infrastructure investment in education and living standards. It assumed that technology was simply there, supplied by scientific advance throughout the world on terms equally available to all, with no environmental constraints. 19th century writers never would have formulated so simplistic and policy-free an approach. When I said that I wanted to review the ideas of earlier economists regarding productivity, Prof. Fabricant reminded me that he had shown his displeasure at my term paper, critiquing the Harrod-Domer formulae for economic growth based crudely on labor-capital proportions. I had suggested that capital could be labor displacing, rather than calling forth an increase in employment proportional to the historical correlation between capital investment and employment. He explained that the history of thought was a waste of time.
If ideas no longer are held, it is because they have been found wanting as economic theory has moved toward today's state of perfection.
All my proposal could do was distract attention from the perfection of modern-day orthodoxy. It was clear that I had to find another dissertation topic. Over one of my frequent lunches with my friend and Professor Gerhard Brie, who also worked at the National Bureau, I mentioned the ideas of one of the American economists whose book I had just found, E. Pashine Smith, a major influence on Henry Carey and author of an energy theory of capital and economic growth. Professor Brie suggested that this topic might seem suitably antiquarian not to antagonize New York University's economics department. If it seemed non-controversial, this was simply because economic historians have ignored Pashine Smith as if the American school never existed. The modern abhorrence of protectionism expunged from history the logic that guided U.S. industrialization under Republican leadership from 1860 through 1912. The American school's trenchant critique of free trade and the theorizing of Ricardo, Malthus, and other British writers caused a cognitive dissonance in the minds of professors eager to promote a view of American history, driven by an inexorable drive for free trade and westward expansion as manifest destiny. Actually, westward expansion was a Democratic Party policy to extend slavery and plantation agriculture. In an epoch when protective tariffs were the principal source of revenue for the federal government, that is, until the 16th Amendment created the federal income tax in 1913. The South based its cotton and tobacco production on foreign markets, seeking to feed its slaves with low-priced grain from the West. The Whig and Republican industrial program called for concentrating industry in the eastern urban centers, whose population would be fed by farms that would find their major market at home, not abroad. But industrialization threatened to bid up food prices, eroding the competitiveness of plantation agriculture. This prompted the Democratic Party to urge free trade, small government, and credit, aimed mainly at export financing, not industry. The slave states in particular decried industrialization and urbanization as culturally decadent, rather than the key to economic progress. At issue was the kind of cultural, social, and political structure America would develop and national trade policy would act to bring about. By the late 20th century, few Republicans were interested in their party's original protectionist plank. Open trade is not just an economic opportunity. It is a moral imperative. President George W. Bush declared in a May 7, 2001 speech, "Trade creates jobs for the unemployed." When we negotiate for open markets, we're providing new hope for the world's poor. And when we promote open trade, we are promoting political freedom. But for 19th century Republicans, free trade led to international dependency and industrial unemployment, blocking economic progress. America's position as an industrial latecomer called for active government subsidy of industry, protective tariffs, public spending on infrastructure, and freedom from British financial power. During the course of my research, I ordered microfilms of P. Shine Smith's correspondence with Henry Carey and others from the University of Pennsylvania's archives, and tracked down related protectionist literature by following the trail from the bibliography mentioned in each book I discovered, largely with the help of my book dealer friends who told me that I was their only buyer for such material. The dissertation was approved in 1968. When I taught the graduate courses in trade theory at the New School during 1969 to 1972, some of my students suspected that I had made up P. Shine Smith as a fictitious alter ego. And indeed, I was inspired to write a history of theories of trade and development, largely as a result of the ideas I learned while studying the American critique of Ricardian logic. In today's jargon, free trade theorizing was agenda-oriented, adopting a series of unrealistic axioms and assumptions to create a logic that would lead along a narrow path to an anti-protectionist conclusion. In my lectures, I emphasized that a logical corollary of the theory of economic growth was the theory of obsolescence. The faster capital and labor productivity rises in leading nations, the further these economies leave low-productivity industry and agriculture behind. This perception had struck economists even before Adam Smith. I was invited to give a paper on this topic for the Catholic Economic Association, which had just changed its name to the Association for Social Economics. At its 1971 meeting, I read a paper on obsolescent factors in the international economy, published in the March 1972 Review of Social Economics and included in this volume, Chapter 10. I have published these lectures as Trade, Development, and Foreign Debt, Theories of Polarization and Convergence in the International Economy, Pluto Press, 1992, now in press in a second, expanded edition. Ever since the Department of Agriculture published its centenary 1963 annual report, A Century of Service, describing its origins as responding to the needs of agriculture, I had sought to write a corrective to show the lead taken by industrial protectionists, warning against the free trade idea that America's economic advantage lay in exporting slave-based plantation products in exchange for English manufactures. This met with the usual cognitive dissonance, as unearthing the political dynamics leading to the Department of Agriculture was not the orthodox position. So the paper went unpublished. I include it in this volume as Chapter 9. In 1975, a reprint company, Garland Press, asked me to select books from my library to reprint and write introductions for them. I used the opportunity to dismantle my dissertation and write new biographies of the major American protectionists. It was published under the title Economics and Technology in 19th Century American Thought, The Neglected American Economists. As a collection of introductions to these reprints, My summaries attracted no attention at all. Only about 100 copies of the book were printed, as the publisher set a price so far above printing costs that sales broke even at only 15 or 20 copies. Shortly after its publication, I surveyed the idea of America as a new civilization for the National Endowment for the Humanities through a contract with the Hudson Institute, where I was chief economist. My aim was to describe how the idea of high-wage labor becoming more productive and consolidating its position by raising educational and cultural levels to best apply industrial and agricultural technology led naturally to an analysis of how a high-consumption society would differ from that of Europe. Class conflict was played down in favor of the harmony of interest doctrines promoted by Henry Carey's school, which tended to theorize along cooperative, materialistic lines, in which economic development was driven simply by man's increasing efficiency at exploiting nature rather than his fellow man. The American school thus replaced the classical economic idea of class conflict with that of international conflict, not only among economies ultimately, but among different social organizations. And that, of course, became America's unwillingness to join any international organization that would have power to dictate its own policy, and indeed, for not viewing itself as a member of the European parties to the Great War that broke out in 1914. It led to America's demand that its inter-ally arms debts be repaid after the war, to its insistence on veto power in the United Nations after World War II, and to its historical go-it-alone stance in global diplomacy. I have been told that all copies of my report, except for my own copy, have been lost or destroyed, so I include it in the present volume. It took a few decades for interest in Peshine Smith and the American school to arise, mainly in foreign countries. In Japan, where Smith had served as advisor to the Mikado more than a century earlier, Bill Totten asked me in 1993 to summarize Smith's relevance for an online publication he edited called Our World. In Norway, Eric Reinert organized a reality economics group. Its members included Arno Dostal, who pursued research relating to Friedrich List's strategies for industrialization, in particular its immaterial aspects, and Ha-Jun Chang, who wrote Kicking Away the Ladder in 2002. I provided a summary of my chapter on Smith from the present volume in the book that Professor Reinert edited. More recently, I juxtaposed the American school's technological optimism to the logic for expansionist empire building in a paper delivered in Wuhan, China, on November 8, 2009, for the Chinese translation of the present book, Chapter 8. The most natural market for such ideas would seem to be today's latecomer nations. They find themselves today in a position analogous to that of the United States at the outset of the 19th century, when it required tariff protection, industrial and agricultural subsidies to avoid becoming merely a hewer of wood and drawer of water. The economic logic behind America's rise to industrial and agricultural domination deserves to be understood, and also its subsequent emulation of trade strategy, repeating that of Britain, seeking to bury the knowledge of its catch-up path. Once in a dominant position, lead nations find their interest to lie in preaching the gospel of free trade rather than protectionism, and ignoring the degree to which technology and productivity growth are a product of active government subsidy. The 1975 version of this book consisted of biographical summaries of the major advocates and some opponents of the American School of Political Economy. My hope in republishing their writings was to provide raw material for a re-examination of how America sponsored industrialization and agricultural modernization. In view of the fact that almost nothing has been done to elaborate this history in the 33 years since this book was published, it may be appropriate here to provide a broad perspective on why these writers were so important. At its most idealistic, American economic thought aimed at creating a society free of the class antagonisms that were impoverishing labor in Europe and its colonies. The doctrines of Malthus and Ricardo made this conflict seem natural and inevitable. Rejecting these ideas, the American school sought to create a new civilization socially and intellectually, as well as economically. It was a civilization more innovative than passively traditional, more pragmatic than ideological, more secular and hence less subject to authority. That is why I include John W. Draper in this volume. The basic logic was that if low-wage nations, with relatively low productivity labor, were to catch up, governments needed to shape prices and incomes to subsidize capital investment and provide basic infrastructure to minimize the cost of living and doing business over time. Without such catch-up protectionism, the international economy would polarize more and more as leading nations consolidated their income and productivity advantages in agriculture as well as industry, capped by a rising creditor advantage as well. 8 major themes are paramount in the development of this doctrine. 1. A labor productivity explanation of wages, including what today is called human capital, to explain why employers of high-wage labor could undersell low-wage producers. 2. An energy measure of capital productivity. 3. A concept of soil fertility and agricultural productivity as the product of capital investment, rather than stemming from Ricardian, original, and indestructible powers. 4. A doctrine of urban-rural balance and the virtues of population density as a political antithesis to manifest destiny. 5. Public infrastructure investment as a distinct factor of production, whose role is to lower the cost of doing business. 6. Regulation of banking and finance as a leading public utility. 7. A broad historical and sociological view of economic analysis. And 8. A materialistic and secular, but non-Marxian technological view of economic evolution. These 8 elements created a uniquely American alternative to the free trade ideas that followed from Ricardian value theory, the population ideas of Malthus, and Europe's liberal opposition to government power in an epoch where parliaments were dominated by post-feudal landholding aristocracies and monopolies carved out of the public domain. The United States owed no land rent to a hereditary aristocracy. It did endow the railroad barons with vast land grants, but subsequently passed legislation to regulate passenger fares and freight rates. The idea was to break up industrial trusts and regulate natural monopolies as public utilities, including power companies and, in time, phone companies and broadcasters. The 3 major economic philosophies developed during 1815 to 1914. Ricardian population theory. Population and wage. Theory assumes all labor to be of equal productive powers. Hence, densely populated countries have the lowest wage levels. Agricultural productivity and land rent, diminishing returns. Soil has original and indestructible powers. Capital application will not affect relative soil fertility. Capital is viewed mainly as a cost, ultimately in the form of embodied labor. The growth in society's economic surplus appears only as an incidental externality. Ignores the non-cost aspects of capital, including social capital and public investment. Foreign trade is necessary to stave off higher food prices in the highly populated industrial nations. Otherwise, food prices and land rents rise, eating into profits. The gains from trade are shared equitably among developed and less developed countries. Wealth, capital, and economic rent increasingly ignored in favor of utility theory, concentrating on personal psychological welfare, less and less political and social theory. Marxism. Population and wage theory is a supply and demand theory of wages determined by the reserve army of the unemployed. The state will employ surplus labor under socialism, implicit agreement with the Ricardians. Concept of capital. Also laissez-faire, despite Marx's recognition that foreign trade exploits less developed regions. Foreign trade is exploitative, but by developing industrial capitalism, it brings the day of socialism nearer. Land rent stems from private property relationships. Socialism will dissolve the institutions of private property, equalizing the return to labor. Scope of political economy. Increasingly a theory of how to transform society's political institutions, its political integument, that block progress. The American School. Productivity gains tend to exceed wage gains, enabling high-wage labor to undersell pauper labor. Hence, profits and wages may rise together. Higher income slows the growth of population, pushing up wages all the more. Also, higher wages spur capital substitution, increasing labor productivity. Finally, higher population density increases productivity, and therefore, increases wage levels. Agricultural productivity and land rent. Soil fertility is a product of agricultural chemistry and the application of capital. Agribusiness enjoys increasing returns as population increases and a circular flow develops between city and countryside. Land rent becomes increasingly a form of profit. Capital's net productive powers exceed its labor cost to an increasing degree. This increases society's economic surplus, transforming the character of labor and society. Foreign trade exploits the raw materials exporters. Protective tariffs are needed to promote industrial capital and high wages. Free trade leads to soil-depleting modes of cultivation. High-wage labor exploits low-wage labor. Hence, younger countries are more amenable to industrialization with their educated labor than pauper labor countries. Industry is needed to develop modern agriculture, just the reverse of the Smith List theory of development stages. Pro-statist in tariff policy and internal improvements, but not domestically. Capital theory evolved into a materialist view of history, shaping consumption and production. A labor productivity explanation of wages. A central concern was to explain how a high-wage economy such as the United States could hope to undersell manufactures produced by pauper labor in Europe and its former colonies. The explanation was that productivity growth tended to exceed wage gains. The American system of political economy, wrote Peshine Smith in 1852,
rests upon the belief that in order to make labor cheap, the laborer must be well-fed, well-clothed, well-lodged, well-instructed, not only in the details of his handicraft, but in all general knowledge that can in any way be made subsidiary to it. All these cost money to the employer and repay it with interest.
Along similar lines, Jacob Schoenhoff wrote in 1884,
It is not by reducing wages that America is making her conquests, but by her superior organization, greater efficiency of labor consequent upon the higher standard of living ruling in the country. High-priced labor means better food and better living, and these supply the American workman with the energy and nerve power for which he is so justly celebrated. High-priced labor countries are everywhere beating pauper labor countries.
It cost money to eat well, keep in good health, and grow strong, and above all, to pursue higher education and training as industry became more skill-intensive. Republicans argued that protective tariffs were needed to promote the capital investment that would make American labor more productive, and that employers would find their interest to lie in paying workers more. Whereas Ricardian theory depicted a wage-profit trade-off in which wage gains were paid at the industrial capitalist's expense, the economy of high wages doctrine showed that highly paid labor was sufficiently more productive to make it attractive to employers. Some British writers did note the wage productivity feedback, but they are dismissed, in footnotes if they are mentioned at all, as being merely mercantilist, much as the American School writes were dismissed as protectionists, as if this meant that they were economically illiterate. The idea that higher wages might be a precondition for rising productivity was never incorporated into mainstream economic doctrine. But I described the long pedigree for views opposing today's race-to-the-bottom ideology in Trade, Development, and Foreign Debt, 1992, regarding Josiah Tucker and regarding Adam Smith. This explained why a high-wage economy would be able to undersell and outproduce low-wage economies, establishing a harmony of interests between labor and capital, an interest not reflected in the strike-breaking activities and opposition to labor unions so often experienced in practice. The productivity explanation of wage levels provided an argument for why protective tariffs would promote higher living standards than could be achieved by exporting cotton, grain, and other raw materials to England. In contrast to the Democrats' advocacy of westward expansion, workers in industrial pursuits were paid out of what they produced, not by the backwoods principle of what they could eke out on the land. Industrialists would not pay workers more just because these men could do better by becoming homesteaders out west. Shifting emphasis to the industrial demand for labor, protectionists argued that what enabled employers to pay high wages were the sales proceeds and profits they earned. An energy measure of capital productivity. Classical British political economy distinguished cost value, reducible ultimately to the cost of labor, from prices that included rents and other property or financial claims that had no counterpart in inherent cost of production. Isolating economic rent as a cost-free and hence socially unnecessary free lunch was part of Europe's fight to free itself from the vestiges of feudalism's military conquest of the land. The American school was more concerned with how industrial technology lowered costs and increased output by productivity gains, above all by capital productivity in terms of energy use per man-hour. Peshine Smith, in particular, viewed capital supplying raw energy as replacing manual labor in the lower tasks of production. Even in agriculture, land was like a machine, using energy and becoming industrialized into what would be called agribusiness. Capital technology in all sectors required rising educational levels, leading Smith and his contemporaries to develop the concept of human capital, breathlessly rediscovered by neoclassical economists in the 1950s. The political corollary was that labor and capital productivity was largely a function of government tariff and subsidy policy. Protective tariffs were needed to enable industrial investment to cover its expensive startup costs, thereby saving America from becoming a raw materials exporter with low productivity labor. A view of soil fertility and agricultural productivity as the product of capital investment. Ricardian rent and trade theory assumed soil fertility to be intrinsic, neither enhanced by the application of capital nor depleted by farming methods. By contrast, the research of Justus Liebig and other soil chemists showed that fertility needed to be maintained by crop rotation or by the application of fertilizer to convert the soil's chemical composition into crops. What Ricardo imagined to be economic rent as a gift of nature thus was better viewed as profit on capital invested in the land and in harvesting its crops. This perception as to the variable productivity of land led the American school to apply the cost of environmental protection to trade theory by pointing out that in contrast to rising industrial productivity, plantation agriculture, headed by Southern slave production of cotton and tobacco, exhausted the soil. The cost of replenishing its fertility as a byproduct of exporting plantation crops and minerals did not appear on the market balance sheet of gains or losses from trade, but it nonetheless existed as what today would be called an externality, a cost not reflected in market pricing. The Whigs sought to document this environmental soil renewal cost in the Patent Office's 1849 report, the second volume of which was written by Daniel Lee. The result was that, contrary to what orthodox history might expect, it was not the farming regions that supported creation of a Department of Agriculture. Rather, it was industrial protectionists who argued that the dominant form of market crop production being pursued in the United States plantation, export agriculture, was economically destructive. I therefore survey the prehistory of this government agency as a new essay in this volume. A doctrine of urban-rural balance. Inasmuch as soil depletion was a major dynamic behind westward expansion, as Southern slave owners pressed for manifest destiny, the economic ideas developed in the tariff debate led to the question of what kind of society the United States would become. A self-sufficient urban industrial economy enjoying rising productivity and wage levels, or a slave-based rural raw materials export economy increasingly dependent on Britain for its manufactures and high-technology products. P. Sheen Smith and Henry Carey advocated putting the consumer by the side of the producer by returning urban night soil, human feces, as fertilizer to the countryside to increase soil fertility. Their alternative to manifest destiny was to promote a flowering of industry alongside farming areas, so as to free the nation from dependency on any foreign source of supply, if not indeed to achieve outright autarky. Public infrastructure as a fourth factor of production. Protectionists viewed infrastructure investment as a vehicle on which to spend tariff revenue. Simon Patton described public investment as a fourth factor of production alongside labor, land, and capital. Rather than being an economic burden as occurred when taxes were levied to pay for war, in an industrial society, the object of taxation is to increase industrial prosperity by lowering costs. Taxes spent on internal improvements would be burdenless if invested in projects such as transport infrastructure in the form of canals and railroads to lower distribution costs, and a postal service and public education to increase productivity. The classic example was the Erie Canal, which lowered farm rents in upstate New York by making cheaper Western grain available. The return to public investment in the form of transportation and other infrastructure was measured not by the earnings it generated, but by its ability to lower the economy's overall cost structure. As Patton elaborated,
parks, sewers, and schools improve the health and intelligence of all classes of producers and thus enable them to produce more cheaply and to compete more successfully in other markets.
Banking and finance as public utilities. The legacy of British banking in the United States was a system based mainly on trade financing and speculation, prompting Democrats such as Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson to fight against a central bank and branch banking so as to prevent bankers from becoming powerful enough to siphon off the economic surplus. It was in France and Germany that banking developed more along industrial lines, coordinated with government planning and a heavily military element in the case of Germany. But the continental European industrial model never gained a foothold in America. What was unique was the government acting as the main credit creator during the Civil War by issuing greenbacks. The subsequent greenback and populist parties, not dealt with in this volume, urged the Treasury to provide bank credit and earn interest on behalf of the public domain, but little attempt was made to establish government banking as a serious alternative to New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Chicago. The main concern was to counter the deflationary price pressures resulting from the government's attempt to roll gold prices back to their pre-Civil War levels. This raised the debt burden on agriculture in particular, imposing financial austerity on the national economy and spurring a pamphlet literature on monetary reform and predatory interest extraction. Patton explained further.
If a state is military in character and passive in its economic development policy, it is a consumer of wealth and not a producer. Its expenses must then be met by taxation based upon moral or political ideals. Europe's aristocratic governments, prone as they were to military adventurism, developed their tax policy at a time when the state was a mere military organization for the defense of society from foreign foes, or to gratify national feelings by aggressive wars.
In view of the fact that Patton was the first economics professor at the nation's dominant business school of the day, the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, the neglect of American school economics is all the more remarkable. A broad historical and sociological view of economic analysis. In creating an alternative to the free trade emphasis on current market prices, incomes, and productivity, the American school extended the scope of economic logic to focus on long-term development, not reflected in market prices. Taking into account soil and resource depletion, capital productivity and technology, education and infrastructure investment, led American economic analysis to develop on lines that came to be called institutionalist. This focus developed alongside socialist and progressive-era critiques of market forces in their political context. Both schools advocated a greater government role in shaping market forces, in contrast to the individualistic lines endorsed by democratic political leaders, and the free trade curriculum maintained at the oldest and most prestigious Anglophile colleges. A materialistic and secular, but non-Marxian technological view of economic evolution. American materialism rejected socialist doctrines of class conflict and pessimistic warnings of impoverishment based on diminishing returns and population growth on the one hand, and also Europe's sanctimonious and authoritarian religion, bolstering the authority of that continent's hereditary aristocracies and vested financial interests. Instead of focusing on class conflict and viewing capital as income exploited from wage labor, the American school viewed capital accumulation as the technological ability to exploit nature, not land and natural resources, as in Ricardian economics, but natural energy, mainly a function of the progress of science and technology. American economists thus were materialist in a non-Marxist way, advocates for industrial capital rather than criticizing it. Whereas the focus of classical European political economy was how to purify industrial capitalism from the rentier legacy, from feudal conquest of the land and the imposition of ground rent, American writers were technological optimists, postulating a harmony of interests between capital and labor, and agriculture too, which they analyzed as an application of capital to the land, or what in time would be called agribusiness. This approach led to the analysis of land as capital, and even its conflation at the hands of John Bates Clark in the 1890s. Yet most historians have focused on the Democratic Party's political and economic policies. The topics of manifest destiny, slavery and abolitionism, land speculation and the creation of wealth American families from insider land and financial dealings have crowded out discussion of the debate over government economic policy to promote industry and technology. Partly this neglect of Whig and Republican political economy reflects the fact that the first major American academic alternative to British free trade economics did not emerge until the 1880s and 1890s. Trained in German universities, the new generation of economists brought back to the United States a social democratic ideology of public regulation of markets. This itself stemmed in no small part from Friedrich List, whose ideas were formed largely in the United States in the 1820s and 1830s in association with Matthew Carey's Philadelphia Circle. In Simon Patton, the American school found a synthesis with the German political economy in which most late 19th century U.S. economists were trained. Along with other German-trained economists, he formed the American Economic Association to serve as the equivalent of Germany's Verein für Sozialpolitik. As usual, free traders opposed the new organization. J. Lawrence Laughlin at the University of Chicago, along with Frank Taussig at Harvard, Arthur T. Hadley at Yale, and the social Darwinist William Graham Sumner, refused to join. The free trade strongholds at Columbia University, Harvard, and Yale promoted the pragmatic, value-free approach of John Bates Clark, along with English individualism. One byproduct was a secularist critique of religious dogma at the nation's land-grant colleges and newer academic centers such as Cornell, as well as business schools such as the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Leading American historians found in the Arab Renaissance a vehicle to contrast to the Inquisition's Catholic Church's stilling of intellectual freedom. Washington Irving wrote on the Alhambra, William Hickling Prescott on the conquest of Peru and Mexico, and Henry Carey Lea on the Spanish Inquisition. A theme picked up John Draper, Simon Newcomb, and Simon Patton. The common denominator with the American school's economic views was the emphasis on empirical analysis as a check on the tendency of deductive reasoning to deteriorate into a dogmatic and distorted worldview. After World War I, the German-trained economists were isolated as institutionalists, a group that included Thorstein Veblen and most academics who analyzed land and monopoly rent as an overhead to be minimized by being regulated or taxed away. Even in the business schools, which had been founded to counter free market logic, the theorizing of Clark and British marginalists replaced the American school of technologically oriented economics. Having little use for this broader protectionist body of theory, the victorious free trade ideology proclaimed itself to be the new perfection of method and content. The economic doctrine that shaped early American public policy was forgotten, a condition in which it remains today. America's leaders no longer found it in the national interest to broadcast a global understanding of the logic and that of British imperial strategists as to how free trade served to crush foreign industry in its cradle, explanations gleefully quoted by American protectionists. Today, foreign countries might equally well cite the early U.S. analysis of the dynamic at work from the victim's vantage point. The logic guiding American economic policy during the Republican half-century from 1860 to 1912 aimed at countering the lock-in effect of existing productivity disparities under free trade. In appropriating the lead nation status hitherto occupied by Britain, the United States has adopted a status quo thinking that causes cognitive dissonance in acknowledging the policies developed by the American School of Political Economy. Having replaced Britain as the world's major industrial and creditor power after World War I, the United States adopted free trade and open financial markets on precisely the grounds that its early protectionists criticized Britain for doing. American economic strategists had learned the lesson that free trade benefits the strong at the expense of the weak. Instead of examining the path by which the United States built up its economic strength, foreign countries have adopted today's free market Washington consensus, do as we say, not as we have done, as a timeless policy guide. This approach misses the strategy by which the United States rose to industrial supremacy after the Civil War. Loss of the American school's critique of free trade logic has left the road open for an acceptance of neoliberal ideology that is blocking countries from upgrading their labor, industry, and agriculture, locking countries that fail to protect their home markets into a syndrome of economic obsolescence. Introduction. Among the many American economists of the two generations spanning the Treaty of Ghent in 1814 and outbreak of civil war in 1861, only Friedrich List and Henry Carey have gained recognition. Daniel Raymond has received some attention as a precursor of List, Matthew Carey as a leading journalist and publisher, and the Canadian-American economist John Ray as an anticipator of various theories of productivity and interest. There have been some excellent studies of post-Civil War theorists of technology and society, as John W. Draper, Simon Newcomb, Simon Patton, and Thorstein Veblen. But no serious scholarship has been published on Alexander Everett, Calvin Colton, E. Shine Smith, Stephen Colwell, Francis Bowen, Van Buren Denslow, and Lesser Lights. No attempt has been made to relate their economic theories to their regional context and self-interest, or to the evolution of American materialism, social Darwinism, and ultimately the attempt to create in America a new civilization differing fundamentally from that of the Old World. Even in the decades following the Civil War, when protectionism was firmly establishing itself as national policy, American academicians ignored the substantial contribution to economic theory made by the American School of Economists. The reason is that this school was uniformly protectionist, whereas academic orthodoxy continued to be dominated by laissez-faire ideology. We are thus faced with the anomaly that while increasingly protectionist policies were being enacted by Congress, their academic defense was muted. Matters hardly were helped by the fact that by the 1870s, the protectionists clustered around Henry Carey had become somewhat of a sect, cut off not only from the mainstream of laissez-faire academic economics, but even from the third generation of protectionists returning from Germany with a greater social idealism. Representative of this period's academic attitude was C.F. Dunbar's summary comment in 1876 that American writers had contributed nothing towards developing the theory of political economy. This deprecation was endorsed by Dunbar's fellow American, Henry W. Farnham. European economists paid more serious attention to the theoretical contribution made by American protectionists. The German Historical School and its admirers in France produced studies of Liszt and his indebtedness to American protectionist thought. Dühring in Germany, Ferrara in Italy, and followers of Bastiat in France elaborated Carey's optimistic theory of economic growth. Works of Carey and P. Shine Smith were translated into French, Italian, and German during the 1850s to 1870s. The Irish historical economist Cliff Leslie wrote a number of articles on the American school. An Italian, Ugo Rabeno, published one of the earliest studies of American protectionism. To be sure, he observed,
in the crowd of American protectionist writers and their contradictors, rarely indeed is originality to be met with, and mere commonplace abounds, and in the advocates of protection, many are the errors which do not even need refutation, whilst their adversaries repeat ad nauseam the old theoretical arguments dogmatized by liberalism. And in general, both sides are so engrossed with the attack and defense of their respective positions and the interests depending on them, that it is vain to expect any impartial scientific conclusions from their labors. Nonetheless, whilst the aspect of American liberalism is marked by an almost complete want of originality and forms no particular code of doctrines, originality is, on the other hand, to be found in some of the more eminent advocates of protection, and they have inspired, to a greater or less extent, all of their contemporaries.
Some interest in the early protectionists developed in reference to their rent theories. Frank Fetter was especially struck by their general identification of rent with interest and implicitly of land with capital. Fetter in fact believed that a major factor in the neglect of these early writers was precisely the dominance of the Ricardian economics in America, especially after J.S. Mill's work gave it a new vogue among American readers. Finding the anti-Ricardian strangely neglected by later generations of American students, he urged his student John R. Turner to write his dissertation on rent theory among the antebellum American economists. One cannot but agree with Turner that students of the history of economic thought have inexcusably neglected the early American economists. Nonetheless, his book failed to ignite any great interest in these writers. A decade later, in 1932, M.R. Iselin wrote a dissertation on the rise of Pennsylvania protectionism, although this was mainly a study in local political history rather than economic theory. Ernest Tailhack's Pioneers of American Economic Thought in the 19th Century, 1935, concentrated only on Daniel Raymond, Henry Carey, and Henry George. Carl William Kaiser's dissertation on the history of the American Protectionist, Free Trade Controversy, Philadelphia, 1939, provided a catalog of arguments relating directly to the tariff debate, but did not investigate any of the theories developed by protectionists beyond the confines of their most immediate application to the tariff controversy. Michael J. L. O'Connor's Origins of Academic Economics in the United States, published in 1944, contains much valuable thinking on the antebellum protectionists, as well as an exhaustive bibliography. Indeed, O'Connor shows the neglect of the early protectionists to be all the more strange in view of their association with a number of the nation's colleges, especially the University of Pennsylvania following the Civil War, and the adoption of books by Colton, Peshin, Smith, and Bowen as texts, as well as Henry Carey's Principles of Social Science, particularly in Kate McLean's one-volume summary, and, after the Civil War, books by Carey's followers, Robert Ellis Thompson at the University of Pennsylvania, and William E. Wilson at Cornell University. Nonetheless, Joseph Dorfman's 6-volume review of American economic thought glossed over the protectionists, omitting altogether such men as Matthew Carey, George Tibbets, and Erastus Bigelow, devoting but 4 pages to Alexander Everett, half a page each to Calvin Colton and Van Buren Denslow, 3 confused pages to E. Peshin Smith, and 8 pages to Simon Patton. Dorfman devoted scarcely a word to Henry Clay, Andrew Stewart, or other politicians whose speeches expounded the protectionist doctrines of the American school. Horace Greeley is described simply as a utopian socialist, and the largest space, 10 pages, is devoted to Francis Bowen, certainly the least original of the self-proclaimed American school. Largely responsible for Dorfman's cursory treatment was his view that there were too many conflicting interests involved in the protectionist cause to make it anything more than a jumble of opportunistic motives. This is a curious reason indeed, for free trade was just as sectionally opportunistic and diverse in its motives as it came to be expounded in the Northeast, the slave South, and the rural West. In fact, it is precisely the sectional divisions and loyalties dividing the Northern protectionists that make their position interesting as an indicator of the evolution of American political economic development as a differentiated whole. The major reason for Dorfman's dismissal of the American protectionists seems to be his dislike for non-laissez-faire policy and doctrine. In this respect, his work is unfortunately prejudiced, for the 19th century American economic mind, to the extent that it was original, was highly protectionist. Dorfman has prejudiced himself, and thus a generation of potentially interested scholars, from investigating the concepts and theories developed by the American school regarding wages, profits, rent, business cycles, population, productivity, and economic growth. Precisely those theories that were most original and characteristically American in the period covered by his work. Nor was interest in the antebellum economic writer stimulated by Schumpeter's judgment that Dunbar's flippant dismissal of them in 1876
has not been invalidated by the information made available by more recent research. It is indeed not true if we take account of problems raised, suggestions made, and factual work done, but it is true if we emphasize the word theory.
Among the protectionists, however, were some who developed theories which, though novel in their time, are today taken for granted, such as the marginal, productivity theories of wages and interest, and the theory of non-competing groups. Others developed concepts now exciting economists as modern innovations, such as the treatment of educational skills as a representative form of capital, the theory of technological obsolescence, capital as a form of energy conversion vehicle, a concept of soil fertility much more dynamic than that found in orthodox Ricardian economics of the day, an analysis of the nature of international dependency and terms of trade exploitation, and an elaboration of the changing nature of labor and land as economic inputs during the course of technological evolution. Members of the American school sought to ground their economic thought in the natural sciences and comparative history, rather than in the deductive trains of moral philosophy and teleology that characterized British political economy. They developed an economy of high wages doctrine and elaborated it as a form of social Darwinism. They argued against the bland Ricardian assumption of the neutrality of money in international trade. They sought to extend abstract economic categories into their sociological and historical institutional setting, and to trace the relationship between economic and technological evolution and the transformation of social forms, including what today is being revived as the debate over post-industrial economic society. That these innovations were made specifically by protectionists is not surprising in light of the fact that the fundamental question underlying the U.S. tariff debate was the nature and consequences of industrial growth. International trade was viewed as only one element of a much broader system of economic considerations. In fact, it is only because protective tariffs were the common policy conclusion of these economists that they have come to be grouped together as protectionists, and the term is somewhat unfortunate. They referred to themselves as members of the American school, and their investigations far surpass the confines of trade theory as such. The term American system was popularized by Henry Clay during the 1820s as a slogan for his program of protective tariffs, internal improvements, and a national bank. This program was defended by protectionists of varying sectional loyalties, whose common ground was an attempt to controvert the doctrines of Ricardo and Malthus that had come to be used as doctrinal support for the Democratic Party's program of free trade and limited federal activity. The most original minds among the protectionist writers were those seeking to supplant the Ricardo-Malthus long-term model of economic growth, emphasizing distribution within a relatively stagnant economy characterized by diminishing returns, with one more optimistic as to the evolution of industrial civilizations rapidly expanding productive powers and rising wage levels. There can be no doubt that protectionist growth theory was often permeated with bias and designed to serve specific sectional interests. It was the product of partisan and politically active men, often journalists and pamphleteers, who had close contact with Whig and, after 1854, Republican leaders. Alexander Everett during the 1820s to 1840s, and Francis Bowen in the 1850s, provided an economic theory supporting the policies of the Webster Whigs from their native Massachusetts. Calvin Colton was the official biographer of Henry Clay and edited his works, enunciating a protectionist doctrine particularly attractive to the northern border states and their allied non-abolitionist classes further north. Henry Carey's economic thought reflected the protectionist needs of his native Pennsylvania. The writings of these economists reflect the sectional antagonisms developing within the Whig Party during the 1840s between the Northeast Seaboard, inland industry, and the border states. Peshin Smith, by contrast, in many respects the most original of the American school, was a protege of William Henry Seward, the ideological leader of the Republican Party during the 1850s. He was representative of the upstate New York protectionists that dominated U.S. foreign policy following the Civil War. The two Sewards, elder and son, along with Hamilton Fish and Peshin Smith, all from upstate New York, were the four highest-ranking State Department officers during the 1860s and felt their regional background quite strongly. The sectional aspect of the leading controversies in American economic thought becomes all the more apparent when it is borne in mind that protectionist doctrine was closely interwoven with the theory of population and agricultural productivity. Indeed, What has become known under the portmanteau term tariff debate was more accurately a debate as to the dynamics of economic growth itself. Its major issue was whether the nation should remain primarily agricultural or industrialize, whether the South should become the focal point of a westwards expanding slave system, or the northeastern and middle Atlantic states become the focal point of an increasingly industrial national economy. Southerners and northern free traders adopted the doctrines of Malthus and Ricardo to argue that industrialization, immigration, and concentration of America's population in an urban East would soon bring about diminishing returns in agriculture, eroding living standards, and ultimately the very institutions of democratic society. It was a Democrat who coined the phrase manifest destiny and Malthusian doctrine, which depicted America's vast land area as its great economic advantage over more mature nations. The protectionist Whigs, by contrast, pointed to the economic burden sustained by America as a result of its great land expanse relative to the sparseness of its population. An expensive transport overhead was needed to distribute the country's output, while the large distances separating urban consumers from western farmlands rendered uneconomic the return to the soil of urban wastes and thereby contributed to soil depletion. A compact urban-rural balance was necessary to achieve optimum farming practices, and an increasing population density to achieve optimum economies of scale, rising wage levels, and higher living standards. Westward expansion would thus forestall the benefits of industrialization. Among the proponents of industrialization, representatives of each geographic region claim to enunciate the truly American school of political economy. The major sectional division occurred over the role to be played by foreign commerce after industrialization had occurred and all available lands filled up. The Boston protectionists Everett and Bowen reflected their region's commercial shipping interests in asserting that although increasing population density enabled increasing returns to occur in manufacturing, it resulted in diminishing returns in agriculture once optimum density was reached. In this respect, they endorsed the Ricardo-Malthus doctrine. Because of diminishing returns, they argued, once America's soil came to be fully cultivated, the nation would have to emulate Britain's example and export its manufactures in exchange for foreign raw materials. They believed that this could occur on favorable terms of trade, and thus would not impair incomes and living standards. By contrast, Henry Carey and his followers, and later Simon Patton, and what became known as the Chinese Wall School, argued for America to aim at total self-sufficiency and virtual economic isolation from foreign countries, at least from those more industrially advanced, such as England. They claimed that increasing population density normally was accompanied by increasing returns in agriculture as well as in industry, and concluded that population growth could occur indefinitely without requiring the United States to become a net importer of food and raw materials. Gradually, an anti-Ricardian and anti-Malthusian doctrine was built up that made a lasting contribution to economic thought and policy. Among its formulators were some excellent minds which, although not unaffected by special interest considerations, pierced the fog of polemical discussion to develop important truths. Nonetheless, the contribution made by the American school remains neglected. The idea persists that these writers possessed, in Schumpeter's words,
hardly more than traces of an impulse to develop analytic tools, little more than a group of would-be theorists who disdained to learn the art of theorizing.
Studies paving the way for a new integration of the varied strands of American political economic ideology have concentrated mainly on its post-Civil War, flowering into full-blown systems. Among the most valuable of these studies are Richard Hofstadter's Social Darwinism in American Thought, 1944, Donald Fleming's John William Draper and the Religion of Science, 1950, and Daniel Fox's The Discovery of Abundance, Simon N. Patton, and The Transformation of Social Theory, 1957. The present study concentrates on the pre-Civil War roots of this ideology. It portrays the evolution of American economic idealism in geographic motion, shifting its political base on numerous occasions as dictated by regional self-interest, but always remaining economic at base. It is in this economic respect that American social and national idealism stood apart from British political philosophy as a system. The latter remained essentially a teleological moral philosophy, which concentrated on ideal ends, not the analysis of processes and their superstructures such as is found in the United States. American economic idealism was as much a materialist protest against orthodox moral philosophy as was European Marxism. Like Marxism, it increasingly widened its scope beyond the confines of marketplace economics to comprehend social and historical analysis in its broadest sense. Unlike Marxism, it was characterized not by a doctrine of class conflict, but of man's struggle to master the forces of nature for the benefit of labor and capital together. Hence its ability to comprehend not only protectionism, but populism, and to include in its ranks such seeming anomalies as Horace Greeley and Henry George. Hence, too, the ever-present tension between Henry Carey's followers, the second generation of American protectionists, which pretty much ignored the fact that their doctrine was being used to support increasingly powerful industrial trusts, and the American national economists, who returned from Germany with a greater degree of sympathy for domestic social reforms, men such as Simon Patten and his colleagues, who took the lead in forming the American Economic Association in 1886. The American school and its successors inspired Brooks and Henry Adams to trace the social consequences of man's growing command over nature's energy resources. Most important from the standpoint of today's simplistic textbook view of American history, it argued against tendencies that are now viewed as monotonic in American history: westward expansionism and manifest destiny, the rise of America as an export power, its growing military role played in foreign continents, and the about-face made by American economic orthodoxy following World War I, when the United States, having supplanted Britain as the world's economic lead nation, adopted in its turn the doctrines of laissez-faire, against which it had struggled for the first 150 years of its existence. Present-day American economic students are taught modernized versions of the doctrines of Ricardo and Malthus, which were controverted more than a century ago by the American school. Today's view of the evolution of American economic and political thought thus diverges from the historical setting of this evolution and is more a product of contemporary orthodoxy than that of the original contributors to and formulators of this broad-ranging ideology. Review of the literature. The reactionary role played by the colleges in forming distinctly American ideals. The economic doctrines unique to America in the 19th century developed almost entirely outside of the nation's academic centers, mainly by journalists and reverends in the retinues of the leading Whig, and after 1854, Republican politicians, and by a few businessmen. This non-academic nexus has led modern observers to dismiss the American school's protectionist theories of trade and development as little more than a special interest lobbying effort. But when we look at the substance of this theorizing, we find a principled and well-informed alternative to the free trade theory taught in most colleges. With few exceptions, the academic presentation of economics in the clerical schools of the Northeast and the major Southern colleges followed the free trade policy conclusions of British moral philosophy. Critics rejected this not because they were anti-intellectual, but because they found the doctrines of David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus unduly pessimistic in rationalizing the status quo as natural and inevitable, including U.S. dependence on England in exchanging its rural agricultural products, headed by slave plantation crops, for urban manufactures. Rejecting free trade as a timeless and universal policy, protectionists held that no a priori rule was appropriate to guide nations at all stages of their development. Arguing that institutions and historical circumstances differed among nations, they accused British liberalism of claiming an unwarranted universality of scope and using circular reasoning to rationalize the status quo and its trade patterns as being natural and inevitable. Much as today's Third World and Asian countries criticize the free market orthodoxy of mainstream economics, so the 19th century American school pointed out that free trade doctrine reflected Britain's own self-interest in seeking to consolidate its status as workshop of the world. It also served the commercial interest of Southern agricultural exporters and their allies among New England shipping interests and the New York and Philadelphia banking houses in opposing a national industrial tariff policy. Policymakers who reject the free market doctrines underlying today's global diplomacy thus could find no better backing than the trade and development theory that enabled the United States to end up outstripping Britain as the workshop and creditor of the world. After the Civil War, the nation rejected free trade, seeking to transform the existing status quo by shaping markets to improve productivity, profits, and wage levels in tandem. Early economic teaching as moral philosophy. Political economy was not originally a separate subject, but was taught as a branch of moral philosophy, typically by men trained in theology or law. It usually covered one of the three terms in the senior year, after the moral philosophy course. A favorite early textbook was the Cambridge Reverend William Paley's Principles of Moral and Political Philosophy, 1785, followed by texts by Reverend John McVicker, 1825, Reverend Samuel P. Newman, 1835, Reverend Francis Wayland, 1837, Reverend Aaron L. Chapin, 1878, and Reverend Arthur Perry, 1866. Their books described how economic growth should occur under a natural free trade order, leading to the existing status quo, and how income was distributed under current production conditions. Rather than seeking to develop a manufacturing base, academicians in the southern and northeastern states found America's economic strength, as well as democratic political foundation, to lie in its agrarian base. They feared that once the western lands were fully occupied and the country was forced to begin industrializing, wages would fall, profits would follow suit, and the country's political institutions would crumble. In this respect, their theories transplanted the doctrines of Malthus and Ricardo. As Wesley Mitchell has noted,
the attitude of early American economists is reminiscent of the American poets who wrote many a verse to the skylark without observing that the skylark is not an American species. It is a sort of literary tradition carried on by men whose minds are not primarily concerned with economics and people who are not thinking hard about problems other than the formal ones which they found in older books, and which they reproduced and solved with their own panegyrics upon the harmony of economic organization.
This degree of abstraction was not disinterested. Academic economics in the United States was as partisan as it was in other countries. Texts departed from the exposition of general principles to pamphleteer, and professorial chairs served as pulpits from which were attacked protective tariffs, communism, and slavery or abolition, depending on the location of the college. As Michael O'Connor wrote in his comprehensive Origins of Academic Economics in the United States,
the earliest northern colleges were Harvard, 1636, and Yale, 1701, seminaries for training congregational ministers. Since the church was the state church, these colleges were essentially state institutions. The Presbyterians created Princeton, 1746. In 1751, Franklin's forerunner of the University of Pennsylvania came into existence, and a Church of England head was appointed in 1754. Columbia, predominantly Anglican, was founded 1754 in New York. The Baptists set up Brown, 1764 in Rhode Island, and the Dutch Reformed Rutgers, 1770 in New Jersey.
Dartmouth, 1769, began as a Congregationalist missionary college for the Native Americans, Indians, on the frontier. Richard Hofstadter has warned against the notion that Harvard and the other colonial colleges were at their inception no more than theological seminaries. In fact, the founding fathers of colonial education saw no difference between the basic education appropriate for a cleric and that appropriate for any other liberally educated man. The idea of a distinctly theological seminary is a product of modern specialism, sectarian competition, and of a reaction to the threat of secularism in the colleges. Such an idea was outside their ken. In Harvard's first 2 generations, only half the graduates became ministers, and the remainder went into secular occupations. However, these secular graduates were brought up with a religious ideology centered on the moral philosophy course, and colonial college presidents were clergymen. Benjamin Franklin tried to establish a more secular trend by appointing laymen as the first trustees of his Pennsylvania Academy in 1751. His proposals for a complete education of youth, 1749, suggested a course of instruction which, although dealing primarily with history, presented it in a predominantly secular economic setting. He proposed that information be given in the curriculum on the history of commerce, on the invention of the arts, on the rise of manufactures, on the progress of trade, and the change of its seats together with the reasons and causes therefor. However, the Church of England soon increased its control over the college in Philadelphia, moving it away from the aims of its original trustees. Columbia College likewise initiated a few independent courses in commerce and government, but gradually became an Anglican appendage. In 1775, Columbia's president was chased back to England, and in 1784, the regents appointed by the state legislature formally took over the school. Similarly, Brown University, which under Baptist control had acted as a force for tolerance and whose trustees gave representation to 4 sects and rejected religious discrimination, gave way as Brown came under the educational influence of Princeton and tended to follow the standard Northern ideas on curriculum. As Cliff Leslie observed in 1880, a distinguishing feature of American political economy is the conspicuousness of a theological element. However, this element was highly elastic as to its implications for public policy.
Assumptions respecting the divine will and designs are employed by both protectionists and free traders in support of their theories. The Malthusian theory is controverted as atheistic in tendency and contrary to the command, meant to replenish the earth. Down to recent time, also, the lecturers on political economy in American colleges were for the most part, as many of them still are, ministers of religion. This circumstance is itself connected with a more general cause, for political philosophy has been left to a theological class who have worked their professional ideas into it, because the laity were engaged in more lucrative pursuits.
It was this worldliness that led commercial interests to supplant the early theocracy after the American Revolution. A kind of clerical aristocratic philosophy emerged as a counterpoise to democracy. As O'Connor describes, the clerical school of political economy was a social instrument, developed when the elite of the Northeast consisted of merchants, bankers, and their professional associates. On the whole, the teachings of the clerical school developed in harmony with the needs and interests of this elite. The result was not a high level of intellectual scholarship. In 1826, Wadsworth made the complaint that our colleges initiate nothing and have to be dragged along by public sentiment. Harriet Martineau, writing in 1837, was especially critical of Boston gentlemen and New England merchants because they were so conspicuous in the pro-slavery mobs. She said the merchants have kept the clergy dumb, overawed the colleges, and given their cue to the newspapers on the slavery issue. The college president was a gentleman who easily dominated the school, his main task being to raise funds from leading merchants, the giving men, and teaching the moral philosophy course, usually including political economy as its final semester. In the clerical political economy, the mercantile Northeast found elements which proved valuable in counteracting the claims of Democrats and Protectionists. From the vantage point of most college administrations, the function of higher education was conservative and quiescent, aimed at instilling moral and political views consonant with the existing division of property and social power. O'Connor cites Jane Marset's claim that youth and innocence may be molded into any form you choose to give them, and Reverend Chalmers' bold statement that,
"We affirm that reason will make anything palatable to the lower orders, and if only permitted to lift her voice in some cool place, as in the classroom of a school of arts, she will attain as firm authority over the popular mind as she wields now within the walls of Parliament. And political economy, the introduction of which into our popular courses has been so much deprecated, will be found to have preeminence over the other sciences, in acting as a sedative, and not as a stimulant to all sorts of turbulence and disorder. It will afford another example of the affinity which exists between the cause of popular education and that of public tranquility. Of all the branches of that education, there is none which will contribute more to the quiescence of the multitude than the one for whose admittance into our mechanic schools we are now pleading."
the resulting economic doctrine opposed the nationalism threatening to alter New England's established trading patterns by insulating the American economy from that of England. The clerical school was cohesive largely because it found a ready-made hole in British thought. It was mindful of its regional economic loyalties, trying to repel the Jacksonian challenge to vested banking interests, as well as the religious skepticism characteristic of the labor movement by 1830. Clerical textbooks usually ignored the slavery issue. Since the cotton planter had largely abandoned Jeffersonianism, it was possible for the Northeastern clerics to regard him as an ally against the Western democracy, as well as against protectionism. Moral philosophy served as the matrix of the social sciences, especially in colleges in the Northeast, literally seminaries of learning that remained under sectarian domination longer than in other regions of the country. Only outside of academia at the hands of the American school did this matrix take on a natural science base, evolving into what Auguste Comte called sociology or social physics, a secularization of economic thought akin to the spirit of early Jeffersonianism. Religious protestations might in principle have been used to justify protectionist policies, as evidenced by the ministers to be found among the protectionists, Colton Caldwell and William Ellis Thompson, much as Bishop Berkeley, Josiah Tucker, and others are to be found among the British mercantilists. So it was by no means religious leanings alone that led to the particular views of economic writers citing theological justification. Once having formulated their views, they rationalized how these might be fitted into the divine natural order of society, so as to give minimum offense to their Christian audience. It is difficult to gauge the extent to which religious sentiment was inserted for rhetorical purposes, but at least it is clear that the religious sentiments often voiced by the American school of economists did not interfere with their materialistic technological foundation of economic theory. The Southern context. The Jeffersonian initiative in building a popular educational system and introducing political economy into the college curriculum reflected the agrarian republicanism of the Virginia dynasty, dominating the national government in the early decades of the century. He wished to construct a model, non-clerical state university as the future bulwark of the human mind in this hemisphere, an institution that would give to every citizen the information he needs for the transaction of his daily business and, in general, to observe with intelligence and faithfulness all the social relations under which he shall be placed. This dream was fulfilled in 1819, when the University of Virginia was established at Charlottesville, less than 4 miles from Monticello. Jefferson considered intercourse with England contaminating and condemned its cultural influence. In 1817, he had translated Destutt de Tracy's treatise on political economy for use as the prospective university's major economics textbook. De Tracy opposed payment of interest by banks and condemned paper money as a combination of robbery and monopoly. He also identified the interests of the poor with those of society generally. But use of his book never really spread, and O'Connor points out that a Jeffersonian economics as such never developed.
After Jefferson died, reaction in Southern political economy became plainly evident. The politics of the Cooper School was broadly in favor of slavery and against the new democracy.
Thomas Cooper started out as an English radical and abolitionist, served time as a Pennsylvania protectionist, moved south in 1819 to become a protege of Jefferson, and ended up an increasingly reactionary president of the University of South Carolina during 1820 to 1834. O'Connor describes the emerging Southern school as
primarily concerned with defending the Southern planter from the protectionist onslaught of Carey's Pennsylvanians. Cooper's group found that the handiest weapon in this struggle was an adaptation of Ricardian political economy. Jeffersonianism, allied as it was with the early progressive spirit of Pennsylvania and the West, expressed a philosophy of leadership advocating change. The Cooper School, on the other hand, was actuated by the need to conserve and defend. There was a Southern tendency to be critical of banks, or at least neutral on the issue. Southerners often claimed that the economic position of Northern laborers was not at all unlike that of slaves.
Mitchell describes Cooper as singularly unobservant of the economic differences between the United States and England.
He wrote his treatise on British models, and had nothing to say in a systematic way about the extraordinary difference between the economic organization of the community where he was writing and that of England. One would have thought that a person concerned with economic problems in South Carolina at the time would have felt it incumbent to show in his treatise what modifications in British views were necessary to take into account the great institution of slavery. But the alterations are not found in Cooper's treatise.
In sum, the Jeffersonians never developed their political idealism into any systematic economic doctrine, partly because of the South's anti-industrialism and its growing espousal of slavery. A slave system hardly could be expected to develop an economy of high wages doctrine, nor were Northeastern writers interested in idealizing a self-sufficient American economy isolated from the growth of international commerce. Sectional interests and the content of economic theorizing. To understand economic theorizing in pre-Civil War America, we must recognize 4 regional schools of economic thought. The Northeastern Clerical School, tied closely to British laissez-faire orthodoxy. The Southern School, inspired initially by Jefferson and then degenerating into the Cooper School. The Middle Atlantic Protectionist School, led by Carey Père Fils, and the Boston School of Protectionism, as a kind of hybrid of the latter 2 schools. These schools diverged broadly in their methodology, content, and degree of optimism or pessimism about the prospects of economic evolution. Originally Federalist, the Bostonian and kindred Northeast increasingly opposed strong government intervention in economic life. It felt its economic interest to lie more with England and the South than with the Middle Atlantic industrial states. Southern plantation interests likewise led the region to espouse laissez-faire doctrine. Both these regions thus found their commercial interest to lie in popularizing British economic orthodoxy, averse to industrial protectionism. Economists in each region usually started with a given policy conclusion, especially on the tariff, which bore special relevance to their local interests, and then tried to rationalize the policy they intuitively felt appropriate for their time and circumstances into a full-blown logical system. I do not mean to say that this policy inspiration of their doctrines means that their objectivity was willfully twisted to serve political and economic self-interest, but simply that most economic theories are time and space-bound. This explains why each region's leading economists tended to ally themselves with one another, as no American environment yet existed as such. For instance, the theories enunciated by the Boston Protectionists, Alexander Everett, Willard Phillips, and Francis Bowen, all Phillips, Exeter, and Harvard graduates, and all active in New England publishing and political life, stand in sharp contrast to the theories of economists from other regions. Although they tended to censure the clerical colleges, they were closer to the elite than were the earlier nationalists. The Bostonian group gave little outspoken approval to their mid-Atlantic predecessors and were very much more conservative towards institutions such as banks. According to John Ray, Alexander Everett was scared of Matthew Carey's work. Everett and his fellow Bostonian Caleb Cushing supported industrial tariffs, but endorsed the Malthusian and Ricardian doctrines of economic and social stagnation that the Democratic Party held could be staved off only by westward expansion. Neither New England nor Southern economists acknowledged the discoveries by Liebig and others in agricultural chemistry that controverted the Ricardian concept of soil on which this expansionist doctrine rested. Everett was more Malthusian than George Tucker of Virginia in his debate with the latter, and Bowen's attempt at anti-Malthusianism was no more successful. This helps explain P. Sheen Smith's disdain for Bowen and Cushing, typical of the attitude of Middle Atlantic protectionists. It was left to Carey's school to achieve a solid anti-Ricardian complement to anti-Malthusianism. Their protectionism was rejected by the commercial and shipping interests of New England and by the cotton interests of the South. Both these regions accepted America's trade dependency as a raw materials exporter to England as rationalized by the Ricardian doctrine of comparative advantage. The implication was that the nation must become increasingly trade-oriented and ultimately imperialistic, reasoning backwards in a static and increasingly abstract circle to defend this worldview. By contrast, the American school became increasingly isolationist, looking to the internal market rather than abroad, optimistic in seeking to develop America as nothing less than a new civilization rather than being pessimistic as to the prospects for labor and its living standards. Mid-Atlantic leadership in creating an American school of political economy. The most uniquely American economic philosophy was developed by protectionists in the Middle Atlantic states, especially Pennsylvania, upstate New York, and Maryland. But their views found little reception in universities. The University of Pennsylvania did not introduce a course explicitly on political economy until 1855, taught by the free trader Henry Vethake. The leading American protectionists centered first around Matthew Carey in Philadelphia and included Hezekiah Niles, Daniel Raymond, and Friedrich List, and later around Matthew's son Henry. This latter group represented the culmination of the self-entitled American School of Political Economy. E. Peshin Smith, Stephen Colwell, Horace Greeley, William Elder, and Robert Ellis Thompson, as well as Van Buren Denslow and Simon Patton of Illinois, shared a common denominator that coincided with the policies advocated by their region's leading congressional representatives, such as Andrew Stewart and later William Pig-Iron Kelly of Pennsylvania, and William Henry Seward and Hamilton Fish of upstate New York in the State Department after the Civil War. These Middle Atlantic states represented the nascent industrial center of America. But prior to the Civil War, industrialization required protective tariffs in the face of British industrial supremacy. The divergence between the American school and that of orthodox British free trade doctrine reflected the nation's diverging self-interest from that of England. The aim of making America economically and also culturally independent of England is especially marked in the treatises of Matthew Carey, William Jarvis, Daniel Raymond, and William Jennison. These protectionists were self-made men, publicists and entrepreneurs rather than academic types. The congressional speeches and official reports of Alexander Hamilton, Alexander Dallas, Henry Clay, Andrew Stuart, and other politicians are of major theoretical value, and it was natural for major protectionists to attach themselves to political leaders. Matthew Carey influenced Stuart, as the Boston protectionists, Alexander Everett and Caleb Cushing, although Democrats, seem to have influenced Daniel Webster. Everett was a personal and legal aid to John Quincy Adams in his early career. Calvin Colton became the biographer and economic theoretician for Clay. Peshin Smith was legal counsel and advisor to Seward throughout the latter's career as governor of New York, senator, and secretary of state. Philadelphia's protectionists were tied closely to Pennsylvania politics, coordinated by Henry Carey after the Civil War. Expressing the self-interest of the Middle Atlantic states, the American school found itself increasingly at odds with Southern and Northeastern self-interest, as well as with the class and political prejudices of these two regions. Their anti-labor attitude, their deflationary hard money sympathies, and opposition to a national bank. Their opposition to as active a program of federal internal improvements. Their support for westward expansion, and their belief that national and world economic development would mean a growing role played by foreign trade, in contrast to the more autarkic economic doctrines of Henry Carey's school. The latter combined optimism as to America's long-term potential with a demonstration that rising income levels for all classes, including labor, could be realized without reordering the political structure of capitalism. This optimism denied the need for westward expansion, not to speak of imperialism, to sustain the nation's rising income levels. Let America develop its home market, and it need not depend upon England, or later on foreign conquests in the Far East. The American school thus sought to dispel the doctrine of implicit class antagonism implied by Malthus, Ricardo, and other British writers, anticipating an increasing polarization of society that would impoverish most citizens. Rather than viewing workers and capitalists as competing for shares of a declining per capita income, it foresaw labor earning a growing share of an expanding per capita national income, while profits on invested capital likewise would rise. Workers would accumulate their own capital in the form of educational and working skills, enabling craftsmen to become entrepreneurs and property owners in their own right. And whereas academic theory held, at least initially, that low-wage countries would conquer high-wage nations in industrial competition, the American school anticipated that the nation's high income and educational levels would give it a growing industrial superiority. Members of this school sought to develop a broad theory of productive powers and social evolution. At its highest level, it grounded its reasoning in the natural sciences, stressing the relation between technology, social transformation, and national development. This school included political figures: Henry Clay, Andrew Stuart, William Henry Seward, William Kelly, etc. Journalists: Matthew and Henry Carey, Hezekiah Niles, Friedrich List, and Horace Greeley. Ministers: Calvin Colton, Stephen Colwell, and Robert Ellis Thompson. Lawyers: Daniel Raymond, Peshin Smith, and in the final stage of the tariff controversy, industrialists such as Erastus Bigelow, Joseph Wharton, John Welsh, John Roach, and assorted lesser lights. The academic mainstream continued to promulgate the Ricardian concept of soil as possessing an inherent and permanent level of fertility, and of labor as possessing a similar intrinsic rate of productivity. The Protectionists, especially the second, post-1848 generation, drew upon the new discoveries in agricultural chemistry and physiology to demonstrate man's ability to improve or exhaust the soil's productive powers, and to enunciate the economy of high wages doctrine, describing how the superior efficiency of highly paid labor was in the capitalist interest. These theories controverted the Ricardian theory that an increasing share of wealth would be reaped by owners of raw materials resources, e.g., by farmers and mine owners, as diminishing returns spread throughout the world, and the iron law of wages, which stated that wage rates tended to settle at subsistence levels. Economies would become rich, the American school claimed, not by exporting raw materials and living off natural resource rent, but by industrializing to earn high income by a positive wage productivity feedback. The pragmatic foundation of American anti-intellectualism. Hofstadter finds a generally anti-academic attitude throughout the 19th century. As popular democracy gained strength and confidence, it reinforced the widespread belief in the superiority of inborn, intuitive, folkish wisdom over the cultivated, over-sophisticated, and self-interested knowledge of the literati and the well-to-do. Just as the evangelicals repudiated a learned religion and a formally constituted clergy in favor of the wisdom of the heart and direct access to God, so did advocates of egalitarian politics propose to dispense with trained leadership in favor of the native practical sense of the ordinary man with its direct access to truth. This preference for the wisdom of the common man flowered, in the most extreme statements of the Democratic creed, into a kind of militant popular anti-intellectualism. It would be more apt to call it contrarianism, for it arose out of a conscious, often highly intellectual repudiation of the doctrines broadcast by the colleges. As Leslie observed, in England, it was not philosophers and professors, but manufacturers and politicians who carried free trade. In America, the manufacturers and most energetic politicians are against it and can point to a so-called national system of political economy on their side, while the opposite system labors under the suspicions attaching to a foreign origin. It thus was not academic theory that was responsible for foreign policy in America, any more than in England. To be sure, much of the anti-academic attitude of the early protectionists stemmed from their frustration at being unable to develop a systematic defense of industrial tariffs beyond a mere doctrine of exceptions to the rules and precepts of British political economy, developed largely on an ad hoc political basis. It is no coincidence that the term self-made man, which Hofstadter takes as the epitome of anti-intellectualism, was coined by Henry Clay in a speech delivered in the Senate in 1832.
Denying that the tariff would give rise to a hereditary aristocracy, he maintained, to the contrary, that nothing could be more democratic. It would give further opportunities for men to rise from obscurity to affluence. In Kentucky, almost every manufactory known to me is in the hands of enterprising and self-made men who have acquired whatever wealth they possess by patient and diligent labor.
Hofstadter finds such businessmen to be anti-intellectual Babbitts. Many undoubtedly were, just as many pious fools taught in the universities. But the textile and carpet manufacturer Erastus Bigelow wrote a sizable treatise arguing against British political economy. The iron manufacturer Stephen Caldwell wrote valuable economic studies, as did Friedrich List and Andrew Stewart, railroad and canal promoters, and self-made publishers such as Matthew Carey, Hezekiah Niles, and Horace Greeley. The fact that many of the most creative proponents of industrialization were not businessmen should prevent their economic philosophy from being dismissed as a narrow businessman's culture. But this is part of the modern era's prejudice against recognizing that non-academic protectionist theorizing was refined into a broad economic doctrine capable of holding its own with the British theories taught in most universities. Hofstadter thus is partial in representing the founding of American business schools as being, at times, anti-intellectual centers dedicated to a rigidly conservative set of ideas. They describe themselves as supporting inductive principles and historical study rather than the deductive philosophy taught by mainstream American colleges. It was not on anti-intellectual grounds that Henry Carey Baird, founder of the first publishing firm in America to specialize in technical industrial books, called in 1885 for technical schools to supplant the classical grammar schools that produce too many gentlemen and ladies, so called. It was an attempt to make the educational system more responsive to the industrial ideology being formulated outside the universities. Hofstadter is not incorrect when he states,
This view of human affairs lent itself too readily to the proposition that the sum and substance of life lies in the business of practical improvement. It encouraged the complacent notion that there is only one defensible way of life, the American way, and that this way had been willfully spurned or abandoned by peoples elsewhere. Many Americans found the true secret of civilization in the Patent Office.
but it was the Patent Office's report of 1848 that described how the phenomenon of mining the soil by plantation crop production undermined the Ricardian theory of soil fertility as having original and indestructible powers, on which he based his theory of comparative advantage. And it was patents that provided the foundation for rising productivity, and hence the replacement of labor by capital. The view of class harmonies was elaborated into a distinctly American form of idealism, based not on the exploitation of labor, but the exploitation of nature by energy-driven technology. The American materialist economists, sociologists, and historians went far beyond what began merely as a doctrine of exceptions in formulating an optimistic materialism in place of the pessimistic British doctrines of Malthus and Ricardo. By the mid-19th century, supporters of industrialism were able to construct broad and comprehensive analytic systems to explain why protective tariffs were in America's national interest, rather than being an inefficient diversion of resources, as depicted in Ricardian doctrine. Hofstadter emphasizes the tendency of businessmen and their supporters to voice anti-intellectual sentiments without stressing that it was a particular form of anti-academicism being voiced opposition to the British moral philosophy and free trade political economy. Industrialization was defended above all on grounds of technological potential and the relationship between technology and society, an approach that found little room to fit into the academic curriculum. Few American colleges of the day were willing to admit protectionists. The University of Maryland turned down Matthew Carey's offer to donate $500 per year to endow a chair of political economy for Daniel Raymond. Carey and his friends met with a similar lack of success when they tried to obtain a teaching position for Friedrich List. And few businessmen, for their part, were interested in financing a protectionist textbook, partly because manufacturers of the day were little more than workmen or master craftsmen with scant funds available for such projects. Industrial tariff protection was supported more as an economic and political ideal than as a lobbying effort by businessmen. At least the post-1848 second generation of protectionists found more academic success in the United States than abroad. In Britain, Leslie observed, Isaac Butt taught at the University of Dublin, and Gustav Schmoller popularized the School of Historical Economics in Germany.
But no regular textbook of the principles of political economy advocating protection has been published in any country in Europe. In the United States, on the other hand, protection is set forth in formal economic textbooks, for example, the treatises of Carey, Thompson, Peashine Smith, Bowen, and Wilson, taught by the professors of several colleges.
However, protectionists were appointed to university positions only on an isolated basis. Their early appointments can be counted on the fingers of one hand. In 1852, Reverend Calvin Colton was appointed to a newly created chair of public economy at the Episcopalian Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, which he filled until his death in 1857. Bowen was appointed to Harvard in 1853, teaching his kind of protectionism for 2 decades and writing a textbook on principles of political economy in 1856 that ran through 5 editions and was used at the University of Pennsylvania after 1859, at Trinity College after Colton's death, and at a few other colleges. It ran through 6 more editions after being revised in 1870 as American Political Economy. Peshine Smith sought help from Henry Carey and Thurlow Weed to obtain a teaching position, and did indeed teach mathematics for 2 years at the University of Rochester, but was unable to obtain a post-teaching political economy. However, his Manual of Political Economy, 1853, went through 9 printings by 1897, and was used at Princeton during 1858 to 1861, at Geneva, Hobart College, and at Cornell University during 1871 to 1874 by William E. Wilson, who wrote his own protectionist textbook on First Principles of Political Economy in 1875, which went through 4 subsequent editions through 1891. Also in 1875, Reverend Robert Ellis Thompson, who had been teaching the Protectionist Economics course at the University of Pennsylvania since 1869, the first of Carey's followers to obtain such a position, published his textbook on social science and national economy, republished in 1882, and thereafter as Elements of Political Economy, with special reference to the industrial history of nations, creating new types of colleges to teach a new approach and content. In reforming an educational curriculum, or for that matter a government agency, it often is easier to start afresh by creating a new institution to replace the old. Perceiving that a new start can avoid the inertia involved in retaining an existing administration, the Republicans established state land-grant colleges after the Civil War. Only then did the materialist strain within American thought achieve serious academic representation, not only by the American School of Economists, but also by historians such as John W. Draper at New York University and Andrew Dixon White at Cornell, and starting with the Wharton School of Finance and Economics at the University of Pennsylvania in 1881. The business community endowed business schools to provide an alternative to the free trade ideology taught in the most prestigious colleges of the Northeast and the South. These new institutions were the path of least resistance to create what today is recognized to be the distinctly American approach to economic thought and national industrial policy. But for the more theocratic institutions, the tendencies described by O'Connor remained dominant. The first separate professorship of political economy, as distinct from moral philosophy, was established in 1871 by Harvard for Charles F. Dunbar, largely to shift the economics course away from Bowen, whose mildly expansionary monetary views offended the college administration. Yale appointed Francis Amasa Walker Professor of Political Economy in 1874, and Johns Hopkins adopted the new chair in 1876. When economics succeeded political economy, a scientific symbolism largely replaced religious references in the textbooks, concludes O'Connor. But despite the altered diction and type of conception, the texts in general continued to express rather similar basic attitudes. The most important development in the academic fortunes of protectionist doctrine was the Wharton School, the first business school soon emulated by the universities of California, Chicago, and Wisconsin. The Philadelphia iron magnate Joseph Wharton specified that the institution should teach how a great nation should be as far as possible, self-sufficient, maintaining a proper balance between agriculture, mining, and manufactures, and supplying its own wants. How by suitable tariff legislation a nation may keep its productive industry active, cheapen the cost of commodities, and oblige foreigners to sell to it at low prices, while contributing largely toward defraying the expenses of its government. And lastly, the necessity for each nation to care for its own, and to maintain by all suitable means its industrial and financial independence. The right and duty of national self-protection must be firmly asserted and demonstrated. Wharton gave an initial $100,000 donation towards founding this school, with an additional $25,000 for a library, and by the time of his death in 1902 had increased his endowment to a total $500,000. The University of Pennsylvania's Political Economy Library was in large part donated by the Protectionist bibliophile Stephen Colwell. Reverend Thompson became the school's dean and first economics professor, succeeded by Edmund James in 1883 and joined by Simon Patton in 1886. Patton, James, and Richard Ely took the lead in founding the American Economic Association in 1885, largely to promote the historical and institutionalist principles they had learned in Germany. Indeed, one can trace a line from Friedrich List and the first generation of protectionists who protested against British economic doctrine on historical grounds, through Schmoller and other members of the German Historical School back to America, via the students studying in Germany from about 1880 onward. However, proponents of laissez-faire captured the association fairly quickly. Envisioning only a narrow scope for political economy, as that discipline narrowed into economics at the turn of the 20th century, it came to eschew the sociological and historical dimensions that occupied the attention of most American economists who had been trained in Germany. The economic writers best remembered today are Henry George and Thorstein Veblen, whose disdain for mainstream economists was reciprocated by the latter. History, social science, and sociology departments became the path of least academic resistance to protectionist theories, as tariffs and institutional development could be studied there as historical phenomena arising under particular historical circumstances. Establishment economists came to view the subject as merely of antiquarian interest. Technological optimism as the basis for the harmony of interests, and indeed, a new civilization. In Europe, the major materialist movement was that of Marxism, inexorably linked with the doctrine of class conflict. But in America, the materialism of Carey's school was associated with an optimistic doctrine of class harmonies, elevating materialism to a form of idealism. Carey helped broaden political economy into sociology, a branch of knowledge conceived in the Comtean sense of integrating all other disciplines. It did so in a way that described how man's conquest of nature was raising the status of most labor from merely manual to more skilled and intellectual tasks, improving productivity, output, and living conditions accordingly. This doctrine rejected British orthodoxy on the ground that it largely ignored how the physical sciences were transforming knowledge and technology. The American school chose to examine the causes leading to society's enrichment, not the class conflicts leading to immiseration. What Simon Patton called the economy of abundance was enabling acquired characteristics to shape a new social psychology, in contrast to Europe with its class conflicts and vicious political system. The economic advisors who shaped America's protectionist industrial strategy looked to active state intervention to shape society into a superior form than that of Europe. They advocated universal manhood suffrage, high educational standards, better labor conditions, especially state support to improve women's and children's working conditions, public charity, and infrastructure spending. And they were active abroad as well as at home. In 1872, Peshin Smith went to Japan to serve as legal advisor to the Mikado, the first of many Republican economists, agronomists, and other aides who formed a brains trust to help shape Japanese development after the Meiji Restoration. But their ideas got little hearing within the narrow confines of U.S. college curricula until the 1880s, as new types of public universities were formed. In fact, there was little opportunity to lit these ideas into the academic curriculum for most of the 20th century. The nation as a whole, particularly its industrialists, found their self-interest to lie in promoting free trade throughout the world, for much the same reason as England had found a century earlier. American industry and farming had come to lead the world in productivity and comparative costs. The nation's policymakers accordingly accepted academic laissez-faire orthodoxy as government policy, as it became a creditor power as well as the world's supreme industrial and agricultural competitor. This policy shift occurred not because of what the universities taught, but because America's evolving role in world affairs called for freer trade. Harvard and other prestige universities espoused the factor-price equalization theorem, dropping the economy of high wages doctrine that even free traders such as Tausig had come to accept by World War I. As the United States appropriated Britain's position of world leadership, its politicians and diplomats appropriated its former mother country's economic doctrines, above all, its free market rationalization of the status quo. There was little reason to adhere any longer to the idealism that had marked the break from England's laissez-faire doctrine. What had emerged as a uniquely American formulation of economics and sociology became a thing of the past. Distinguishing characteristics of the American school. C.P. Neal's monograph on Daniel Raymond, an early chapter in the history of economic theory in the United States, 1897, and G.B. Mangold's review of the labor argument in the American protective tariff discussion, 1908, are the first two serious American studies of the history of protectionist economic theory in the United States. Neal demonstrates the basically different points of reference of early American protectionism from that of British orthodoxy. The concern with the growth of national wealth and output rather than with the distribution of money incomes. The concept of capital, labor, and land in terms of their productive powers, not simply their earnings relative to their costs of production, and the related areas in which American writers have exerted an influence upon the development of economic science to an extent that has not heretofore been conceded. Mangold's study demonstrates the extent to which these theories were developed in reference to the tariff debate, with the scope and focal point of each party's doctrine relating to its tariff position. In no area of 19th century American thought is the link between economic theory and political self-interest clearer than in the realm of wage theory in its application to international trade and, to a lesser extent, westward expansion. As the country's economic and political conditions evolved, protectionists and free traders shifted positions on the correlation between population density and wage levels, and between wage levels and foreign trade patterns. Early advocates that America remain an agrarian and raw materials exporting country argued that its relatively high wage levels preempted it from early industrialization. As long as workers could support themselves on sparsely populated Western lands, raising foodstuffs and exchanging them for European manufactures at favorable prices, there was little to be gained from industrializing. Protectionists from Alexander Hamilton through Matthew Carey found themselves obliged to argue that American wage rates were not all that much higher than those of England, and that even if they were, the United States enjoyed lower industrial costs in areas such as raw materials and water power.
The disparity in this respect between some of the most manufacturing parts of Europe and a large proportion of the United States is not nearly so great as is commonly imagined,
asserted Hamilton in his report on manufactures.
It is also much less in regard to artificers and manufacturers than in regard to country laborers. and the disparity, which does truly exist, is diminished in proportion to the use which can be made of machinery.
Foreign manufacturers faced higher costs for raw materials, land rent, taxes, and transport charges, whose combined weight
Cannot be estimated at less than 15 to 30%, and are more than a counterpoise for the real difference in the price of labor.
In 1824, Henry Clay was still playing down the implication that high wage rates left America unsuited for industrial self-sufficiency.
The argument assumes that natural labor is the principal element in the business of manufacture. That was the ancient theory. But the valuable inventions and vast improvements in machinery, which have been made within a few past years, have produced a new era in the arts. We must no longer limit our views to the state of population and the price of wages. Capital, ingenuity in the construction, and adroitness in the use of machinery and the possession of raw materials are those which deserve the greatest consideration. The state of our population is peculiarly favorable to the most extensive introduction of machinery. We have no prejudices to combat, no persons to drive out of employment.
American protectionists thus emphasized not only that production costs of varying types differed among nations, but that production functions themselves differed. International trade not only threw industrial labor in one country into competition with that in foreign countries, it threw the capital of one nation into competition with the labor of others. Nations that fostered the most rapid accumulation of capital would emerge industrially supreme. These arguments initially were put forth at a time when protectionists were not looking to the votes of labor for support. Most industrialists hoped to keep American wage levels as low as possible, and many campaigned to block laborers from acquiring Western lands except through land speculators. In fact, only in the first decade following the Revolution could laborers migrate freely to Western lands. Under Hamilton's tenure as first Secretary of the Treasury, public lands were sold mainly to speculators, with credit being granted exclusively on purchases of 10 or more square miles, 9 square miles after 1796. Not until 1830 did substantial reform begin to be effected, made permanent in 1842, permitting colonists who squatted on and cultivated the wastelands to secure tracts not exceeding 160 acres. The Homestead Law was passed in 1862. Pointing to the Depression experience of 1819 to 1820, protectionists argued that industrialization would employ women, children, and seasonal farm labor that would remain idle in agriculture. Tariff protection would provide a more stable internal market, without the depressions and unemployment that occurred under America's existing trade pattern. It also would attract immigrants, especially skilled laborers, while the spread of mechanized production would mitigate the influence of America's relatively high wage rates. The choice was not really between whether American labor should produce agricultural or industrial commodities. It was whether much of this labor would be employed in manufactures or not at all. Growth in the country's urban industrial population would sustain a thriving home market for farm and plantation products. It followed that industrial tariffs would render the United States economically independent of England by protecting industries that had been brought into being by America's commercial isolation during the Napoleonic Wars. Nearly all these arguments had been made in Hamilton's report on manufactures, with the exception of references made to the new industries that had been fostered during the war. The institution of universal male suffrage in the 1820s obliged protectionists to formulate their arguments with an eye towards demonstrating labor's self-interest in high tariffs. In the past, it had been argued that the accumulation of American machinery would, if anything, lower wages by supplanting labor. This argument was dropped in favor of the pauper labor doctrine, which stressed that tariffs protected labor and its wage rates rather than simply capital and its profit rates. Free traders argued all along that it was not desirable for Americans to undersell foreign manufacturers or to be brought into direct market competition with them, because they must equal or surpass them not only in skill and machinery, but also in human degradation.
We must drive our laborers from the fields to those dismal and demoralizing abodes where they sink into hopeless stupidity and penury, where health and morals frequently become victims to hard labor and to the laws of poverty and hunger,
Stated one opponent of industrialization in 1821. The Protectionists appropriated this thesis, pointing out that the equalization of poverty need not occur if America protected its labor and capital by high tariffs. This could enable sufficiently high wages and profits to be paid to sustain high domestic living standards and new investment. As Stanwood describes this turnabout, each side in the tariff controversy took over the position of the other and found in the situation ground for supporting its own cause. The Protectionists aver that wages are higher in this country than elsewhere, and they put that fact forward as a reason for a high tariff to protect high wages. The free traders deny that wages are really higher here than abroad, taking into account their purchasing power, e.g., that free trade would lower the expenses of manufactures bought by laborers, thereby increasing the real value of their money wages. In 1827, the Harrisburg Convention asserted that a nation whose labor was dear could not without ruin carry on commerce with one whose labor was cheap, at least not without seeing its own wage rates depressed to that of its trading partners. Protectionists also continued to exploit the unemployment argument for high industrial tariffs, pointing out that many laborers did not care to abandon their profession and become farmers, but would be forced to do so in the absence of protective tariffs. This pauper labor argument became especially pronounced after 1828 and remained a mainstay in the protectionist arsenal until it was dropped for a while during 1848 to 1860, only to reappear stronger than ever for more than half a century following the Civil War. The early protectionists, and later those of Carey's school, denied the factor proportions theory of industrial advantage commonly held in the early 19th century. According to this theory, high population density connoted world industrial advantage because of the low wages industrial workingmen were obliged to receive in densely populated, highly competitive urbanized nations such as England. Free traders emphasized that American wage levels were high and would remain so as long as the nation possessed abundant Western lands. This was the so-called backwoods theory of high wage levels. Open migration to Western lands, at that time lands west of the Alleghenies, reduced the supply of available urban labor, resulting in high wages simply on supply and demand grounds. Protectionists replied that relative supply factors alone were not sufficient to explain America's high industrial wage levels. There also must be a real product high enough to sustain these levels. This developed into the marginal productivity explanation of wage rates. It was not the superabundance of land, but of capital, the protectionists argued, that enabled high industrial wages to be paid, and not a superabundance of labor but of capital, that provided nations with world advantage under conditions of mechanized production. The factor endowment theory, maintaining that densely populated nations enjoyed industrial advantages, might have held true before the Industrial Revolution, but it no longer was valid. Capital was displacing labor with increasing cheapness. Free traders argued that America would all too soon become a manufacturing power. As its western lands began to fill up, the backwoods safety valve would close, and population growth henceforth would be confined largely to the cities. The increasing supply of urban labor would press down wage rates, enabling America to compete with England only as its working class became more miserable. This was a uniquely American interpretation of Ricardian doctrine. Ricardo had argued that the onset of diminishing returns in agriculture increased wage costs to the capitalist by forcing up the price of food while channeling a rising proportion of income into the hands of landowners. According to orthodox Ricardianism, the filling up of American lands would work to raise American money wages, not lower them, although real wages would be eroded. On a more long-term interpretation of Ricardianism, land-rich countries like America ultimately would gain the world's industrial advantage. As lands filled up in England and the more densely populated nations, money wages would rise, along with land rents, increasing industrial costs. The centers of industry would shift away from the high food cost, and thus high wage countries, to the low food cost, hence low wage countries, with the result that America might in time become the seat of world industry. This logical culmination of the Ricardian system seems to have occurred to no one in the 19th century, if only because it was too far in the future for economists who were not accustomed to think in terms of long-term limits of growth. The debate over wage levels and industrial advantage prior to the Civil War was linked directly with the parallel debate over the effect on wage levels of westward expansion. Free traders found their political base largely in the South, which wanted to bring more land under the slave, plantation system of cultivation in order to maintain their world monopoly in cotton. This required a parallel expansion into non-slave territories so as to feed the growing slave labor force with low-priced foodstuffs. The Protectionists wished to hold labor in the East, where increasing population density would lead to greater efficiency of production, hence, a greater real product out of which to pay industrial wages. Free traders continued to depict industrialization in terms of aggravated conflict between man and money, between capital and labor. Only the free availability of Western lands could support labor's wage rates, the expansionists and free traders argued. Only maintenance of the United States as a primarily agricultural, raw materials exporting country could sustain democracy and working order. Whilst the tariff does not enhance the wages of labor, the famous Walker Report argued in 1846, the sales of the public lands at low prices and in limited quantities to settlers and cultivators would accomplish this object. The power of the manufacturing capitalist in reducing the wages of labor would be greatly diminished. Mangold's book breaks off in 1847, just at the point where the wage tariff controversy was about to undergo another turn at the hands of Henry Carey and E. Peshin Smith. Although the pauper labor argument had become a staple of protectionist logic at the hands of Colton and other first-generation protectionists, Carey and his followers saw that it assumed an implicit antagonism between labor and capital. Enlightened capitalists would find their self-interest and competitive power with foreign nations not in paying low wages, but in paying high wages, because highly paid labor was much more efficient than pauper labor. Protectionism was needed to maintain employment by increasing capital to employ labor, along with what British economists called the wages fund, and to provide federal revenues to extend educational facilities and related internal improvements. Increased association and division of labor in the eastern states, argued Carey in his Past, Present, and Future, 1848, would increase America's productive power sufficiently to sustain rising wage rates out of an expanding product. But Western migration would retard the rise of labor productivity in the East, holding down the nation's output and wage levels. Shortly thereafter, Carey's associate, Peshin Smith, drew upon Liebig's investigations in physiology to demonstrate that although well-fed and well-clothed labor might cost more to its employer on a per diem basis, it more than made up for this in the form of increased work capacity. High per diem wage rates connoted low unit labor costs. The exploited factor in production was nature, not labor. Industrialization favored increasingly skilled labor, leaving manual tasks to be performed by machines, rather than by men, who were freed to steadily elevate their status in economic society. Hence the evolution of protectionism, indeed isolationism, into an economic and social ideal. This idealism paled after the Civil War, especially with the growth of trusts. Protectionists found the more sophisticated arguments of Peshin, Smith, and Carey to be too tenuous, and reverted to the old pauper labor argument for protective tariffs. True, this argument presumed identical production functions among nations and overlooked the correlation between high wages and high productivity. It also overlooked the tendency for developing economies to substitute machinery for manual labor. But the pauper labor argument was easy to grasp and was thus more workable from a political point of view. Furthermore, now that the slave system was broken, protectionists dropped their opposition to westward expansionism. The economy of high wages doctrine was thus left to free traders to exploit and passed into the hands of men like Francis Amasa Walker, Jacob Schoenhoff, and Frank Taussig. If high per diem wage rates connoted low unit labor costs, they argued, then America did not really need tariff protection. Common to all parties in the debate was the rise of the economy of high wages doctrine, which viewed the production process in terms of technological factors rather than simply money factors. English thought of the period followed the wages fund doctrine in asserting that an increase of capital tended to raise wage rates and lower profit rates because the wages fund was a financial pool of money to be divided among the labor force on a supply and demand basis. The American economist emphasized that an increase of capital would increase productive powers by much more than IJ's cumulative cost in terms of labor. Capital was to be thought of not simply as embodied labor, although this tended to determine its financial return, to be sure, but in terms of the hundreds of manpower equivalents of work effort for which it substituted. The increase in industry's physical stream of output far surpassed the growth in industrial revenues, thanks to the growing powers of nature tapped by mechanized industry. This view of capital, in terms of the doctrine of productive powers rather than in simple financial terms, is stressed in Neal's study of Daniel Raymond, who helped focus American protectionist doctrine on what Lauderdale had called public wealth as distinct from private riches. Raymond viewed capital as a productive factor in its own right, capable of performing tasks which human labor simply could not do, such as introducing absolute uniformity of production, hence the mass production of interchangeable parts. To the English, the concept of technology referred to the mix of capital, labor, and land, viewed as distinct factors of production. To the American school, it meant a broader social system of organization, with capital substituting for both labor and land under conditions of increasing returns and increased real earnings of all classes. The tariff controversy in its sectional aspects, 1776 to 1860. At its birth, the United States was formed as a compound of two competing economic systems, a nascent northern industry, still largely in its household phase, associated with an essentially family farm agriculture, and the slave South with its plantation system. In this dual economy, the North sought to promote an urban-rural balance between domestic agriculture and industry, each sector growing as it consumed the products of the other. The South, by contrast, looked increasingly to foreign markets for its cotton, tobacco, and other plantation products. This economic division was reinforced by a similar national division along political lines. The Northern Federalists supported a strong national government. The Southern Jeffersonians favored a decentralized system safeguarding states' rights. Until the 1820s, this political division was muted by the somewhat countervailing political attitudes of North and South towards England. The South showed itself willing to promote domestic industry as the price necessary to achieve economic and hence political and military independence from England. The North, especially those seaboard states whose politics were strongly influenced by international shipping interests, felt that it had much more to gain by protecting its commerce with England than in promoting its modest industry. The War of 1812 interrupted this commerce and channeled northern capital away from shipping into producing manufactures previously obtained from England. By the end of the war, a fairly sizable industry had developed, but its prosperity was thwarted by restoration of normal trade with England. Northern federalism became protectionist, while the South moved economically closer to England, abandoning its early ideals of American economic independence from its former mother country. The interests of these two regions, whose divisions apparently had been reconciled during the 4 decades spanning the Declaration of Independence in 1776 to the Treaty of Ghent, now diverged over an expanding range of issues. America's economic relationship with England in the 1810s, the tariff in the 1820s, states' rights in the money and banking system in the 1830s, westward expansion in the 1840s, and the extension of slavery into new territories in the 1850s. All these controversies were incidents in the basic conflict between the plantation system and urban industry, each with its own requirements as to the country's domestic and foreign policy. The seeds of the political tensions that finally erupted in civil war lay in the uneven rates of economic and political absorption of the West. At stake was whether the United States should remain basically agricultural or should deliberately foster its industrialization. As early as 1776, the British economist Josiah Tucker anticipated the tensions that the tariff debate would create within the United States.
The southern independent republics will never consent to prohibit the introduction of the manufactures of Old England merely for the sake of encouraging, to their own loss, the manufactures of New England, a people whom they both hate and despise, nor will the New Englanders give a monopoly to the southern provinces against themselves. Therefore, as both will act separately, according to their respective local interests, the English manufacturers will find an easy admission with very little or no obstruction.
Implicitly, Tucker concluded, America would remain an economic satellite of England because of its political divisions. But not until after 1816 did these sectionalist tensions rise to dominate the consciousness of most Americans. It was towards England that they felt their greatest hostility, a feeling held most of all by the Southern Jeffersonians. The major sectional antagonism perceived was between East and West. As Rufus King of New York put matters in 1786,
every citizen of the Atlantic states who emigrates to the westward of the Allegheny is a total loss to our Confederacy. Nature has severed the two countries by a vast and extensive chain of mountains. Interest and convenience will keep them separate, and the feeble policy of our disjointed government will not be able to unite them. For these reasons, I have ever been opposed to encouragements of Western emigrants. The states situated on the Atlantic are not sufficiently populous, and losing our men is losing our greatest source of wealth.
Still, the West became mainly as the decisive swing region in the implicit long-term economic and political struggle between North and South. At the Virginia Ratification Convention of 1787, William Grayson prophesied that the contest of the Mississippi involves the great national contest, that is, whether one part of this continent shall govern the other. The northern states have the majority and will endeavor to retain it. And it was indeed the North that was destined to increase its economic and political weight in the Union by virtue of its more rapid population growth, magnetism for immigration, and industrialization. North-South antagonisms nonetheless remained muted during the interruption of trade with England during the War of 1812. To be sure, Alexander Hamilton's report on manufactures, 1791, alluded to the fact that
it is not uncommon to meet with an opinion that though the promoting of manufactures may be the interest of a part of the Union, it is contrary to that of another part. The northern and southern regions are sometimes represented as having adverse interests in this respect. Those are called manufacturing, these agricultural states, and a species of opposition is imagined to subsist between the manufacturing and agricultural interests.
But he anticipated that experience would gradually dissipate this view.
The aggregate prosperity of manufactures and the aggregate prosperity of agriculture are intimately connected by the growth of home market reciprocity of demand between the two sectors.
The South would find its interest to lie in endorsing industrial protection and creating a thriving northern market, just as would the agricultural West. This view glossed over a fact that became increasingly apparent. As northern industry expanded, the North's political weight grew correspondingly. Its population and industry were concentrated, whereas that of southern plantation agriculture was dispersed. Because the House of Representatives was weighted on the basis of population, the envisioned economic reciprocity between industry and agriculture would concentrate political power in the North. The South, therefore, had a clear political reason for preferring foreign markets to northern ones. Export markets did not entail a corresponding growth of northern political power in Congress. An additional consideration was the economic fact that while a growing urban demand for agricultural produce might be of some benefit to the South, it also would tend to increase the price of Western provisions as northern capitalists bid against southern planters. This would increase the latter's food expenditures at the same time that it increased their home market. To be sure, these views did not rise to the forefront of Southern consciousness until the mid-1840s, but a wary attitude towards Northern prosperity existed from the outset. The very first act passed by the American Congress was the Tariff of 1789, which levied quite moderate duties of 5 1/4% to 7 1/2% ad valorem, with 10% on glass, the most highly protected item of this period, and specific duties for spirits, sugar, and coffee. The official words of the act cited these duties as being necessary for the support of the government, for the discharge of the debts of the United States, and the encouragement and protection of manufactures. During the next 15 years, tariff rates were nearly tripled on many articles, in a series of 5 steps generally of 2 1/2% each. In 1790, to meet the growing national debt. In 1792, for the protection of the frontiers and other purposes. In 1794 and 1797, to finance rising federal expenditures. And in 1804, to provide funds for the government to patrol its waters against pirates. By the latter year, tariffs had come to average some 17 1/2% to 20% on most of the major dutiable imports. The principle of protectionism was voiced in the presidential messages and published letters of the presidents, although the immediate cause of tariff increases was the government's pressing need for revenue. In December 1707, an embargo was declared against all trade with England in an attempt to end her practice of boarding and searching American vessels and impressing into her own navy naturalized Americans who once had been British citizens or simply had no papers to prove otherwise. The embargo reduced U.S. imports by nearly 60% and was followed in 1809 by the Non-Intercourse Law, which for a year forbade any trade with France as well as with England. Hostility toward England grew, led in the House of Representatives by Clay and Calhoun, and in 1812 erupted into naval war, whereupon all tariffs were doubled to finance U.S. military operations. It was therefore natural that the presidential messages of Jefferson and Madison should endorse the ideal of American industrial independence from England. The Treaty of Ghent, which brought peace with England and restored normal commercial relations between the two countries, ushered in an era of economic warfare that was soon reflected in domestic U.S. politics. The treaty was drawn up on December 14, 1814, and was ratified by Congress on February 17, 1815, ending the economic isolation that had nurtured America's industrial growth during the foregoing 7 years. Imports jumped more than tenfold, from $13 million in fiscal 1814 to $147 million by 1816. This great influx of low-priced British manufactures threatened to extinguish American industrial capital and thereby to restore American industrial dependence on England, leaving it prone in the event of future warfare. Agitation for higher protective tariffs soon followed the treaty, with the strongest pleas for national industrial self-sufficiency being made at first by two non-Northerners, Calhoun of North Carolina and Henry Clay of Kentucky. The result was the Tariff of 1816, in which the principle of protectionism was explicitly acknowledged by law for the first time since 1789. According to the U.S. Tariff Commission's official history of the tariff, protection for the first time ceased to be incidental and became a direct object of the tariff, supported by all parts of the country. The new tariff introduced a schedule of minimum duties, a forerunner of the American selling price system of import evaluation for tariff purposes. The tariff was not yet a political issue, capable of dividing the nation into sectional camps. First of all, the South did not yet feel an economic antagonism toward Northern industry. Venting their hostility mainly toward England, the Jeffersonians believed that domestic industry was necessary to secure American economic independence, even though this might shift the nation's economic weight in favor of the more industrialized sections of the North. Jefferson acknowledged the evolving state of affairs in his much-publicized 1816 letter to Benjamin Austin. In contrast to the laissez-faire sentiments that he earlier had held largely on grounds of political philosophy, Jefferson now stated that,
"We have experienced what we did not then believe, that there exist both profligacy and power enough to exclude us from the field of exchanges with other nations, that to be independent for the comforts of life, we must fabricate them ourselves. We must now place our manufactures by the side of the agriculturist. The former question of the political philosophy of free trade is now suppressed, or rather assumes a new form. The grand inquiry now is, shall we make our own comforts or go without them at the will of a foreign nation? He, therefore, who is now against domestic manufactures must be for reducing us either to a dependence on that nation or to be clothed in skins and live like beasts in dens and caverns. Experience has taught me that manufactures are now as necessary to our independence and our comfort."
Advocates of industrialization, realizing the de facto protection being laid by revenue tariffs, wisely did not emphasize this effect, or even claim it as the leading motive behind the increased rates, although the annual messages of all the presidents consistently upheld the principle of protectionism. As Stanwood describes these developments,
The Republicans were now the national party, the upholders of the majesty of the Union, the champions of a bold and progressive policy. Jefferson himself began unconsciously an approach to the Federalist position, but did not proceed far on the road. Madison, and still more completely Monroe, passed over and occupied the enemy's camp. In the early days of the government, there was no actual party division on the tariff question, but unquestionably the Federalists, with Hamilton at their head, were more zealous for the cause of manufactures than were the Republicans. All this had changed long before the year 1816. A Republican Congress ordered the reprinting of Hamilton's Report on Manufactures. Republican committees took pains to proclaim their friendliness to the policy of protection. On the other hand, the opposition to that policy was nowhere more strongly manifested than in Massachusetts, Federalist in politics and commercial by occupation. Accordingly, although the tariff was still in no sense a party question, it is true as a broad proposition that parties had exchanged positions as much on this issue as on any other.
Madison, who had early been a mild opponent of protective duties, called for tariffs in his 1815 message to Congress to produce goods that could be made from domestic raw materials and to relieve the United States front a dependence on foreign supplies, ever subject to casual failures. Secretary of the Treasury Alexander J. Dallas submitted a protectionist report to Congress in February 1816, contributing to the tariff enacted in April of that year. The 1816 tariff did not prove sufficient to isolate domestic industry from foreign competition, as evidenced by the Depression of 1818 to 1819. From this date, a fundamental split emerged between the free trade standard bearers, who favored revenue tariffs to finance a low to moderate level of internal improvements and other activities, and the advocates of protective tariffs to be set at whatever level was necessary to protect American industry from foreign competition, with a rising level of spending on internal improvements to dispose of these funds. By 1824, the tariff and its related issues had been propelled to the forefront of American politics. The South was coming to view industrial protection as being against its economic and political interest, and saw Britain as a much more lucrative market than the North. North-South sectionalism emerged full-blown when the 1820 census reapportioned the country in 1823. The Clay-Webster debate that preceded the 1824 tariff reflected the political realignment over the tariff issue. Speaking for the industrial interests of the Middle Atlantic states, Henry Clay coined the term American system to describe his three-part program of protective tariffs, internal improvements, and a national bank. Webster, as would Gallatin and Walker after him, defended laissez-faire and revenue tariffs, ostensibly on grounds of national equity. He claimed that protective tariffs would benefit a particular section, the industrial North, at the expense of the common weal, which he portrayed as the interest of all the nation's consumers in seeing lower prices. It was clear that the particular regions on whose behalf he spoke were the South and the Northeastern shipping region. Nowhere in the tariff controversy was this sectional division more clearly expressed than by Clay.
It is said that the South, owing to the character of a certain portion of its population, cannot engage in the business of manufacturing. The circumstances of its degradation unfits it for the manufacturing arts. The well-being of the other and the larger part of our population requires the introduction of those arts. What is to be done in this conflict? The gentleman from Virginia would have us abstain from adopting a policy called for by the interest of the greater and freer part of our population. But is that reasonable? Can it be expected that the interests of the greater part should be made to bend to the condition of the servile part of our population? That, in effect, would be to make us slaves of slaves. What is the argument? It is that we must continue freely to receive the produce of foreign industry without regard to the protection of American industry, that a market may be retained for the sale abroad of the produce of the planting portion of the country.
The sectionalist nature of the vote on the 1824 and subsequent tariffs is clearly revealed in Table 3, see PDF. The South voted almost solidly against the tariff, although the border states of Kentucky and Missouri supported it, along with Delaware and parts of Maryland. Massachusetts, Maine, and New Hampshire joined with the South in opposing the tariff, along with the New York City commercial area. But the Middle Atlantic region and upstate New York carried the day, with only a 5-vote margin to spare. Stanwood observes the inherent tensions in this situation, in which the two regions that hoped to become industrial centers, the Middle Atlantic states and New England, were ranged on opposite sides, and the two agricultural regions, the South and the West, which at that time meant the United States west of the Alleghenies, were also separated. New England, on the whole, believed that its industrial progress did not need a protective tariff. The northern middle states were sure they could not prosper without protection for iron, glass, and other things. The West was persuaded that its salvation depended upon the establishment of a steady home market for its grain. The South was still more strongly convinced that a protective tariff would limit its market for its great staple of cotton and render more expensive all the foreign merchandise which it must of necessity import. New England was to change its attitude before the next great contest. The West, and some northern states, were gradually to fall under the influence of the South through political alliances, and only Pennsylvania on the one hand and the South on the other were to be true to the principles they held in 1824. Still, the tariff was popular, and all the candidates for the presidency professed support for it, including even Crawford from the South. Andrew Jackson helped save the 1824 Act from defeat on its passage to a third reading. By 1826, Webster joined forces with Clay, citing New England's development of manufactures as having prompted his shift. The government, he maintained, had driven New England capital from shipping to industrial pursuits, and this capital had to be protected regardless of whether its origins had been well-grounded or not. In the summer of 1827, about 100 advocates of protection convened at Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, producing a series of memorials, recommendations, and a flow of pamphlet literature. Protectionist sentiment was at its height, and in preparation for the presidential elections the following year, even the Jackson men strove to appear friendly toward domestic industry. The House Committee on Manufactures was dominated by Jackson supporters, who carried out a somewhat ingenious strategy said to have been devised by Martin Van Buren. This consisted of submitting a high tariff bill to the House, including especially high tariffs on raw materials consumed mainly in New England, in particular by its textile manufacturers, flax and wool, and commercial shipping operators, hemp and shiprope. Many of the highest and most obnoxious duties were on articles not even produced to any great degree in the United States, such as heavy shiprope. It was hoped that this schedule of duties would prove sufficiently high to cause New England to desert the protectionist cause, so that failure to enact a protective tariff would be laid at Adams' doorstep. All attempts to debate the tariff package and modify the offensive duties were cut off by the Jackson supporters. As Frank Taussig described matters, the Jackson men of all shades, the protectionists from the North and the free traders from the South, were to unite in preventing any amendments. That bill, and no other, was to be voted on. But enough Adams men from New England voted for the bill to pass it, and after a successful trip through the Senate, where Webster supported it as the lesser of two evils, it was enacted into law as the Tariff of 1828, popularly known as the Tariff of Abominations. In 1829, official U.S. statistics showed the ratio of tariff revenue to total dutiable imports to have risen to 54%, and the following year to 62%, a level not approached again until the 1930s. Stanwood makes much of the argument over the constitutionality of protective tariffs, an issue that had resurfaced in the 1890s. The power to defeat a protective tariff, either by academic argument against the soundness of the principle of commercial restraint, or by setting off the interest of the South against that of the North, was definitely lost in the contest of 1828. Nothing remained but to dispute the constitutional power of Congress to pass such laws, with free traders denying that the constitutional power to regulate commerce with foreign nations implied the power to levy imposts designed to promote one branch of industry at the expense of another. In this respect, the 1828 bill may be viewed as laying the ground for the nullification fight of South Carolina 4 years later, by which time permanent lines had become drawn to separate the slave South from the North. For little as the fact was recognized at the time, the tariff was but the skirmishing ground where the leaders of the conflict tried and proved the weapons that were to be used in the final campaign a generation afterward. Already in 1831 preparations were being laid for what promised to be an intensive tariff controversy for the presidential election year of 1832. The Free Traders held a convention at Philadelphia and appointed Albert Gallatin to write a memorial to Congress, along with a survey of evidence prepared by Henry Lee. It was in answer to this meeting that the Protectionists convened in New York and asked Alexander Everett to write a memorial in reply. He drew upon a number of arguments for protection that Gallatin himself had set forth in 1810, when as Secretary of the Treasury he had been asked to prepare a report on manufactures after the manner of Hamilton's 20 years earlier. By this time, the tariff issue had become linked inexorably with the question of internal improvements. A major motive behind the protectionist attempt to increase federal expenditures on such improvements, e.g., the Cumberland Road and associated transportation projects, was to dispose of the rising tariff revenues. Free traders, for their part, recognized that economy in federal expenditures must follow from low tariffs. Hence, the Democrats now claimed that the appropriation of public money for internal improvements was as unconstitutional as the tariff, by promoting one branch of industry at the expense of others, a party plank that was repeated in every Democratic national platform until 1860. With the tariff of 1832, the industrial North succeeded in dropping most of the abominations of the 1828 Act in exchange for replacing the system of minimum tariffs with simple ad valorem duties. A more solid protective tariff was thereby established, to which New England could well adhere. But the conflicting interests between North and South had become so deep that South Carolina refused to collect duties at the port of Charleston, claiming that the tariff was
in violation of state rights and a usurpation by Congress of powers not granted to it by the Constitution, the power to protect manufactures nowhere granted to Congress, but on the other hand is reserved to the state. The interests of South Carolina are agricultural, and to cut off her foreign market and confine her products to an inadequate home market is to reducing her to poverty.
The other southern states followed with protests of their own, and in November, a convention held in South Carolina passed a resolution declaring the U.S. revenue laws null and void. Jackson responded by ordering the Navy to take charge of the port of Charleston and forcibly collect the duties which South Carolina refused to levy. South Carolina agreed to suspend its nullification pending a political settlement, which came in the form of Clay Compromise Tariff of 1833. This called for a scheduled reduction in tariff duties to a uniform ad valorem rate of 20% by 1842. Duties as established by the 1832 tariff in excess of 20% were to be reduced on January 1, 1834, by an amount equal to 10% of this excess, with additional 10% cuts to be made in 1836, 1838, and 1840. Of the remainder, half was to be removed on January 1st, 1842, and the balance on July 1st of that year, by which time all maximum duties were to stand at 20%. Clay and his supporters apparently hoped that a future Whig Congress might restore higher tariffs, but as the Democrats remained in office through 1840, the compromise proceeded on schedule. Not until 1841 did the Whigs return to power, promptly calling for higher rates and a return to specific duties. Their 1842 tariff established somewhat higher rates, averaging about 33% on dutiable imports. But destiny seemed to be conspiring against the Whigs. Although they won the 1840 and 1848 elections behind two generals, William Henry Harrison in 1840 and Zachary Taylor in 1848, they had sought to consolidate the vote of the border states by nominating somewhat Democratic-leaning anti-protectionists for the vice presidential posts, John Tyler of Virginia in 1840, Tippecanoe and Tyler too, and the obnoxious Millard Fillmore in 1848. By a quirk of fate, both Harrison and Taylor died quite early in office, leaving Whig politics to be governed by men whose principles were adverse to those of the Whig stalwarts. Increasingly, the national contest between the slave South and the industrial North took the form of controversy over the issue of westward expansion. The South deemed this necessary to maintain its worldwide sugar and cotton monopolies. Slaves had to be fed cheaply to produce Southern staples at prices enabling Southern planters to undersell foreign producers. For this purpose, new land was needed to keep pace with the growth of the slave population, as well as to extend cotton and sugar cultivation. Furthermore, the extension of these two staples would serve to bring more slave states into the Union, thereby maintaining the congressional balance between free and slave states. From the South's vantage point, policies that retarded Northern population growth and its associated demand for Western provisions worked to reduce the cost of maintaining slaves and therefore supported the South's relative political power. Nowhere was this sectional aspect of westward's expansion expounded more clearly than by David Christie in Cotton is King, or Slavery in the Light of Political Economy.
The opposition to the protective tariff by the South arose from two causes, the one to secure the foreign market for its cotton, the other to obtain a bountiful supply of provisions at cheap rates. The close proximity of the provision and cotton-growing districts in the United States gave its planters advantages over all other portions of the world. But they could not monopolize the markets unless they could obtain a cheap supply of food and clothing for their Negroes, and raise their cotton at such reduced prices as to undersell their rivals. A manufacturing population, with its mechanical coadjutors, in the midst of the provision growers, on a scale such as the protective policy contemplated, it was conceived, would create a permanent market for their products and enhance the price. Whereas, if this manufacturing could be prevented and a system of free trade adopted, the South would constitute the principal provision market of the country, and the fertile lands of the North supply the cheap food demanded for its slaves.
Because of the South's predominantly slave economy, an increase in America's white population would necessarily be concentrated either in the North or the West. If it could be diverted from northern cities to western plains, it would find itself employed at producing grain and other agricultural produce, rather than constituting a part of the northern urban population, bidding against the South for these provisions, and thus cutting into the profits of the slaveholders. Southern politicians therefore concluded that
we must prevent the increase of manufactories, force the surplus labor into agriculture, promote the cultivation of our unimproved western lands, until provisions are so multiplied and reduced in price that the slave can be fed so cheaply as to enable us to grow our sugar at 3 cents a pound. Then, without protective duties, we can rival Cuba in the production of that staple and drive her from our markets.
it was a Democratic writer who in 1845 coined the slogan, "Manifest Destiny." And indeed, had the Civil War not occurred, continued pressure for expansion on the part of the Southern states were very likely have led to a materialization of their hope to extend the Union into Cuba, and even the West Indies, an eventuality some Northerners believed would lead to an offsetting Northern expansion, quite likely into Canada. Westward expansion was secured following the 1844 election, in which Polk led the Democrats to victory over Henry Clay, who suffered defeat of his presidential aspirations for the fifth and final time. The new Secretary of the Treasury, Robert Walker, prepared a report in 1845 which integrated the Democratic Party's policy of Western expansion, ruralization of the country's population, free trade, a restrained pace of internal improvements, and continuation of the sub-treasury depository system for federal monies so as to prevent these funds from being added to the commercial banking system's monetary base, where they might be used to finance industrial expansion. In asserting the principle of revenue tariffs, namely, that no more money should be collected than is necessary for the wants of the government, economically administered, Walker implicitly called for a curtailment of internal improvements. He somewhat arbitrarily suggested that experience proves that, as a general rule, a duty of 20% ad valorem will yield the largest revenue. He therefore recommended that all minimums and specific duties be abolished and ad valorem duties substituted in their place. Walker further advocated the Democratic Party's long-term position that in the interests of labor, the highest duties should be levied on luxuries rather than on goods competing with American manufactures.
If we reduce our tariff,
He speculated,
the party opposed to the Corn Laws of England would soon prevail, and admit all our agricultural products at all times freely into her ports in exchange for her exports.
Britain's repeal of the Corn Laws did indeed occur in 1846, but was the result of domestic economic considerations and not at all the product of any negotiated reciprocity of free trade between England and America. Walker further asserted that a protective tariff
discriminates in favor of manufactures and against agriculture by imposing many higher duties upon the manufactured fabric than upon the agricultural product out of which it is made.
He reiterated the time-worn appeal
That the duty should be so imposed as to operate as equally as possible throughout the Union, discriminating neither for nor against any class or section.
As noted above, protectionists perceived this interpretation as operating in favor of the South against the industrial North. Lack of industrial protection, they retorted, discriminated against domestic industry in favor of that of Britain. Walker himself acknowledged that free trade was intended primarily to benefit the slave states.
The cotton planting is the great exporting interest, and suffers from the tariff in the double capacity of consumer and exporter. Cotton is the great basis of our foreign exchange, furnishing most of the means to purchase imports and supply the revenue.
This report paved the way for the so-called Walker Tariff, which operated from December 1846 through July 1857, and which reduced rates to about 25% of dutiable imports. In 1857, tariffs were once again reduced, and averaged only 20% of dutiable imports during 1859 to 61, the lowest for any period during the 100 years 1821 to 1920. Protectionism was to triumph only in conjunction with an issue more popular, that of slavery and free soil. For the first time, the Northeast Seaboard states joined forces with the Middle Atlantic states to defeat the divided Democratic Party and the South. To recap, during the War of 1812, the Middle Atlantic states had stood firmly with the South in supporting American military, political, and economic independence from England. But for the next 4 decades, the Southern and Northeastern Seaboard states joined together to dominate national policy over the tariff issue, national banking policy, and westward expansion. Only in the 1860 elections was the Southern Compact with the Northeast broken as the Democratic Party itself broke into 2 warring factions, the Free Soil Democrats behind Douglas and the Southern pro-slavery faction led by General Cass, paving the way for the Republican victory behind Lincoln. The early conflict over America's attitude toward England, protective tariffs, and the desirability of industrializing the nation had never actually been dropped, but had become overlayered by more domestic issues. Popular opposition to a national bank and to a strong federal government, and popular support for westward expansion, had held the balance in favor of the anti-industrial party. But as the slavery issue became more acute, the scales swung back toward the advocates of industry and free labor. The nation was forced to make a definitive choice as to which system would dominate its economic life: a rural or an urban system, agriculture or industry. In making this decision, the United States was deciding whether to adopt an expansionist or an isolationist ethic, whether to concentrate its capital or disperse it, whether to create a national bank to finance internal growth, or whether to oppose the system of finance capital and paper credit. Although the moral end of the Civil War was free soil and later abolition of slavery altogether, the economic end was protectionism and industrialization and the ancillary policies that went with it. Hugo Rabeno's perspective on the American school. By the 1890s, protectionists such as Simon Patten concentrated on integrating their economic theories with social sciences, rather than attempting to trace the origins of their theories. Many of the theoretical contributions elaborated by the early protectionists, such as the economy of high wages doctrine, had for some time been abandoned to the free traders. Toward the end of the 19th century, the American protectionists received more attention from European economists than from American writers. Eugen Dühring in Germany, Francesco Ferrara in Italy, and followers of Frédéric Bastiat in France were elaborating Henry Carey's optimistic theory of economic growth under increasing returns with minimal reference to his tariff theories. Hugo Rabeno came to the United States from Italy with a view of American protectionism shaped by the writings of Friedrich List. Rabeno endorsed protectionism as a transition policy for countries with infant industries, but decried the isolationist extreme characteristic of much American literature in the second half of the 19th century. This antagonism to isolationism led him to dismiss much of the idealism that characterized the American protectionists from Carey through Patten. The final section of Rabeno's book, American Commercial Policy, 3 historical essays, is an attack on these writers, drawing largely on Frank Taussig and other opponents of protectionism, including Edwin Seligman, whose extensive library he used in reviewing the country's protectionist literature. Rabeno's initial chapters on the historical evolution of tariff policy in the United States are an exercise in delineating the law of 3 stages, popularized early by Sir James Stewart and Adam Smith, and later by List. According to this theory, countries passed from the agricultural stage through the industrial stage, finally arriving at the commercial stage. By commercial is meant industrial exporting, as early countries in the New World were, if anything, more export-oriented than the more industrialized nations of Europe. This warping of colonial development to provide raw materials to their mother countries impaired their industrialization and indeed their agricultural development for crops not amenable to the colonialist plantation and slave systems. In many respects, Rabeno's work reflects both the biases and perceptions of his contemporary American historians. Because the only early industry in America was household handicrafts, whose output did not come onto the market, its development was not retarded by English protectionism until after about 1760. Following the Revolution, the decision to industrialize was pressed by Hamilton and others as much on political as on economic grounds, although Hamilton's report on manufactures contained most of the economic rationale that characterized later American protectionism, e.g. the arguments that over time, protective tariffs will work to lower prices as they foster the accumulation of capital, that the prosperity of rural agriculture and urban industry are closely connected, hence the harmony of economic interests between northern and southern states, that the home market is more stable than the foreign market, that industrial labor is amenable to greater division and increased efficiency than agricultural labor, that raw materials producers are obliged to pay the costs of international transport on both their exports and imports, and in general, that the importations of manufactured supplies seem invariably to drain the merely agricultural people of their wealth. Rabbeinu stresses that List, like Hamilton, did not endorse protectionism as an ideal, but only as a transition stage policy, a policy that later became more and more a system of isolation at the hands of proponents of the American system. List, like Hamilton, admitted free trade theoretically and as a final conclusion. This moderate free trade sympathy leads Rabbeinu to judge that, even if List was not the originator of modern protectionism, he was certainly the first and the only one who raised it to an organic and scientific system. This would only be true if one conceives of system in terms of the theory of stages of economic development, a rough generality at best. By contrast, Henry Carey, P. Sheen Smith, and their followers refined protectionism as an overall economic system, integrating the distribution and growth of incomes of all classes with the process of technological change under conditions of increasing returns, including in agriculture. Rabbeinu dismisses this intellectual achievement as being part and parcel of capitalist protectionism, the defense of trusts and of super-profits, a far cry from the infant industry logic of Hamilton and List. Carey, states Rabbeinu, was the first to formulate the absolute theory of protectionism, and can lay the flattering unction to his soul of having been the forerunner of the so-called Chinese wall men. Freedom of trade ceases to be an ideal, however remote. His ideal now is association and concentration through the coexistence of industry and agriculture, and the approximation of producers to consumers. Free trade always brings about ruin, protection, general well-being. This is a harsh judgment, but by the 1890s, many protectionists had indeed regressed from the sophistication achieved by Carey and P. Smith prior to the Civil War. Trusts were indeed being built up behind tariff walls, deflation was threatening the country's farmers, and the social context of protectionism had dropped much of the nobility of its early ideals. The contrast is not really perceived by Rabbeinu, nor has it been observed by most subsequent historians. For instance, Rabbeinu states that an aversion to the settlement of the Far West might have made sense in List's day, the 1820s, but not in Carey's time, the 1840s and 1850s, when free land was far away and required considerable capital for its cultivation. This overlooks the fact that the struggle against westward expansion prior to the Civil War was largely in opposition to the extension of the slave system, and expressed the faith that growth of America's internal market would be able to support the growth of the nation's economy long after the frontier had been reached and fully settled. Rabbeinu barely perceives that the most important impact of the frontier in American history is in the expanding internal market, in contrast to England's primary reliance upon foreign markets. The tendency of protectionism in the United States to be much less trade-oriented than that of England was due to its thriving home market and its high wage levels. Instead of impairing the accumulation of capital and the development of efficient production methods, these high wages led to just the reverse of what orthodox Ricardian doctrine would have anticipated. The economy of high wages doctrine could be pushed too far, however. Rabbeinu held that, at a certain phase of capitalism, the high wage phase, capitalists must lower wages to maintain profits and therefore espouse free trade. Protectionism becomes a drag on industrial development by enabling less efficient producers to remain in business longer than they would under free trade. Now that American industrialization was consolidated, protectionism was becoming merely extortionate. The infant industries of List's and Carey's day had become adults. Rabbeinu denied that protectionism could raise wage levels. This could be done only by banning immigrants, not goods. Nor could it any longer, under the era of trusts, lead to falling prices for consumer goods. Real wages would be depressed under the trustified system of capitalist protection. America was passing into the third stage of its history, in which its industry was being consolidated, the condition of the working class depressed, and protection becoming useless to the capitalists. Now that America's vacant lands were virtually all filled up, protection nullifies the efforts of capitalism. The land rent threatens. Hardly an optimistic picture, nor an historically accurate one, but one that has been elevated to orthodoxy by the Turner School of Historians and its followers. End of audiobook. Section 1.